Author's note: this novel began as a response to two troubling global trends. The first is the growing comfort with nuclear appeasement. The second is the steady rise of global political violence. Through this story, I wanted to explore the dangers of both while offering a possible path forward through the idea of the Charter, a political framework built to redefine what a state can be. This book is the first in a planned 9-part series. The first trilogy begins in a near-future world grounded in realism and science, and its later volumes move beyond Earth to the cloud cities of Venus and the scavenger worlds of dead civilizations where technology has become indistinguishable from magic. The second trilogy carries these ideas into a fantasy realm. The third trilogy unites both universes into one. The Charter and its principles form the through line of the entire series, expressed in its central creed: every life is sovereign. If you have listened this far, thank you. Please consider liking or subscribing to help this story and its message reach more people. Prologue. Unknown satellite, retrograde heliocentric orbit, 2056. After 30 years in space, the kinetic rods entered the atmosphere. From the moment the first struck at nearly Mach 200, it was over in 3 seconds. Blinding white lines split the sky. Hardened silos built to survive a direct nuclear blast cracked apart as armored doors were punched inward. Bomber bases flared in searing flashes that rolled across runways, and mobile launchers vanished into rising clouds of dust. From orbit, the pattern looked impossibly precise, a constellation of impacts stitched across the Earth. On the ground, people froze where they stood, unsure how to react at the speed of the destruction. Command posts fell into stunned silence, officers staring at blank screens where arsenals had been. The nuclear shield they had built their lives around was gone. The first wave was devastating. Every known ICBM silo, bomber base, and mobile launcher vanished in a near-simultaneous strike. The second wave dismantled the global thermonuclear production infrastructure. Then came the third wave. Unha Park, Silver City, New Mexico, 2043. Necessity may be the mother of innovation, but overcoming trauma is often one of its many fathers. Unha hadn't expected to discover anything wondrous, yet this very lack of expectation gave her eyes to see the extraordinary. Her parents worked long hours, always reminding Unha, her older brother Jungyun, and their little sister Mina that it was for their future. But everything changed when her little sister passed away, and her parents decided the family needed a fresh start in Silver City, New Mexico. Her mother was a trauma surgeon, and her father was an aerospace engineer. She stitched people back together and held their hands when their organs failed. Unha's mother was the strongest person she knew, strong enough to keep a notebook with the name of every patient she lost and every loved one she failed. But to this day, she couldn't say Mina's name. The change had happened gradually, but completely. First, the family pictures vanished from the walls. Then her brother left for college and never came home for Thanksgiving, only sending a polite excuse about a group project. His cheerful texts that once lit her phone every day thinned to once a month, then faded to silence. She stared at her most recent but still unread message. She thought to herself, "Where are you? What are you doing?" Silence crept in to fill the gaps. At first, her parents only missed a night here and there, always making sure at least one was home. Then dinner became something eaten over laptops, or alone in separate rooms, the clatter of forks replaced by the hum of screens. Her mother called them work emergencies. Her father sat at the table but seemed as if he were somewhere else entirely. Unha felt the stillness settle over the house like a sheer blanket, smothering sound and breath, until even she stopped noticing it. One of the house's original features was an observatory, installed by the builder, an avid amateur astronomer. But over the years, it had been neglected by the owners who followed. When newly built, it had everything an amateur astronomer could want. There was a circular aluminum dome designed to rotate for a full view of the sky, a concrete pier for stability, and a motorized shutter to remotely open the dome. At its heart stood a Meade starfinder 16-inch on an equatorial mount, one of the largest amateur scopes available at the time. But for 2 decades, the observatory had fallen into disrepair, filled with dust and silence. The first thing Unha and her brother did after moving to Silver City was explore the new house. Compared to their cramped Manhattan apartment, it felt like a palace. They climbed eagerly into the observatory, their steps echoing in the warm, airless dome. "Oh wow," Unha whispered as her brother nudged her forward. He stopped short himself, caught in silence. "This is kind of epic." In the center stood a telescope, massive and still. It's like walking into a forgotten temple, Unha murmured. She reached out, brushed her fingers along the optical tube, and felt an echo of eternity. Unha turned to him, and excitedly hopping, she said, I think we can fix it. He grinned and eagerly affirmed, I know we can. But you know what Dad will want. A work plan and a cost estimate. And you're writing the cost estimate. He emphasized the last point by pointing at her. Deal, she said, already mentally estimating the cost. When her parents entered the observatory, she threw herself into their father's arms, and her brother picked up their mother in a bear hug. Their parents were overjoyed to see their children's reaction to the surprise observatory they had found for their star-obsessed children. They began with cleaning. They dusted the mirror covers, replaced seals, and wiped away sandy grit. Then they checked what still worked. The dome motors turned sluggishly, but could be repaired. The alignment gears were stiff yet intact, and the power bus was corroded but recoverable. Night after night under work lamps, with grease-stained hands and cold feet on concrete, they brought the observatory back. They replaced cables, rewired motors, and tuned the alignment. The mount stuttered less each time until it moved as if it remembered. By midsummer, they finally opened the shutter, rotated the dome, and aimed the Mina Star finder at the moon to gaze in wonder at the pale contours of Mare Crisium. Her towering basketball star brother hopped like a 5-year-old and spun Unha around at their accomplishment. Though the observatory was repaired, it kept its quirks. Over time, Unha learned the telescope's rhythms, the way it stalled just before alignment and needed coaxing after long rests. They moved like aging dance partners, each anticipating the other's missteps. The dome above always opened with a reluctant wheeze, as if unsure the sky was ready to be seen. Yet the first glimpse never failed to thrill her, light and shadow spilling across the eyepiece like a secret revealed. Just before switching on the cooling fan or aligning the mount, she always paused, drew a deep breath, and in the quiet curve of the dome found the courage to look up and dream. After months of practicing, the idea for her science fair project crystallized. She had written her project title with care. Temporal Variability in Thermal and Optical Properties of the Moon, a long-term study. It sounded complex enough to be taken seriously, but dry enough not to attract attention. What it meant was that she was watching for faint and subtle changes on the moon. But to make her dream a reality, her old dance partner needed a makeover, and she knew her father was going to ask for the work plan and cost estimates. She spent the night putting it together and waited until the perfect moment to pitch her plan, right before her father's first sip of morning coffee. $30,000, her father exclaimed. He was still half asleep as he filled the water reservoir. The coffee machine hissed, its lights blinking impatiently while he turned, brows furrowed. Unha held her ground. That's for everything. A thermal camera to catch heat, filters to split light by wavelength, and cooling systems to cut noise, all the pieces needed to see what most people would miss. It's itemized. She nudged the tablet across the counter. Besides, Jung-Yoon and I caught the astronomy bug from our star-obsessed parents, who made 3-year-olds memorize star charts. You're just reaping what you sowed. He didn't answer right away, and that silence told her she had him. He poured in milk, stirring longer than usual, then asked in a calm tone, thermal imaging for the moon. Unha matched him evenly. Yes, frame synced with optical, so I can catch transient heat events with millisecond precision. I already drafted the capture script. His eyebrows lifted, equal parts surprise and pride. He took a slow sip of coffee. You're 13. Unha, the picture of innocence, only smiled and said, I know. Another sip. He set the mug down, leaned in, and scanned the page. You already got quotes? She'd spent her whole life watching her brother present work plans and cost estimates, so she spoke with practiced confidence. It's scaled down from the professional rigs. I even marked parts we can swap for used or salvaged components. I will share my folder with the cost research. He sighed, clearly proud despite the cost. But I want update reports. Budget tracking, and I handle all the wiring. And Unha, would you let me do this with you? Unha blinked back tears, and for a moment could not speak. All she could do was rush into his arms and whisper, I would love that. The plan was straightforward. She wanted the telescope to track the moon on its own, improve accuracy with GPS timing, and add a beam splitter so it could capture optical and thermal data together. For 3 weeks she worked beside her father, sending Jung-Yoon regular updates, until they were ready for the cameras. The first was a fast-frame CMOS, a specialized high-speed camera pulled from a local science teacher's storage closet where it had been forgotten for years. It could capture 120 frames per second with little noise. The teacher's name was still scratched into the side in faded marker, but Unha didn't care. It worked better than she expected and cost almost nothing. The thermal camera was different, salvaged through one of her father's old aerospace contacts after sitting for years in a warehouse. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that made you automatically brace with both hands. They spent 2 long weekends in the observatory upgrading the old Mina Star finder. The dome became a hive of scattered parts and tools. Wrenches lay beside smudges of thermal paste, paper towels were stained with grease, and a thermos of tea cooled quietly in the corner. It reminded Unha of being 5, watching her father and brother work on projects without her. Then the pang came sharp as she realized Mina would have been 5 too. She thought to herself, "I miss my little heart." She wiped her tears and steadied herself, and mentally told herself, now was the moment of truth. The beam splitter was the trickiest piece, like balancing glass on a thread. It had to sit dead center on the telescope's light path, steady without a tremor. They built the bracket from salvaged aluminum stock, cut and filed by hand until it shone. Her father did the cutting, but Unha made the final alignments, inching the screws with steady hands, chasing perfect symmetry. A germanium lens carried the invisible heat to one camera while visible light bounced to another. On the screen, both beams lit exactly where they should. Her father paused, his eyes lingering on her. In that moment, she felt his pride fully, and she knew she was no longer the shy girl who once clung to his coat at parties. She was wrapping up the final Python script when she noticed her brother's text, "Sir Scope-a-Lot is almost ready to fly. Good job following my plan." Tears filled her eyes as warmth spread throughout her body, and she responded, "You are banned from the observatory." Finally, everything was in place. Unha proudly stood side by side with her father beneath the dome, the new assembly gleaming in the late light. The telescope looked like a machine dreaming of the stars. Her father draped an arm over her shoulders. "You built this," he said quietly. Her eyes welled with tears. She drew a breath, then answered, "We built this," and leaned into him. Her mother had taken time off to see the moment, tidying the observatory as she grumbled about the mess. Holding hands with her family, Unha flicked the switch. The fan hummed. The CMOS camera stirred to life. On the monitor, the moon appeared in twin spectra, pale light and ghostly heat. Unha smiled. "Let's find something no one's seen before." Weeks later, Unha leaned over the console, her eyes moving between 2 softly humming monitors. Their quiet vibration felt loud in the stillness of the observatory. Above her, the aluminum dome rotated with a frictionless murmur, tracking the waxing moon as it climbed over the desert hills. Heat and light from the cratered surface poured through the telescope's aperture, captured by her carefully modified rig. The fast-frame CMOS camera ticked steadily. Beside it, a cooled thermal camera gathered long-wave infrared radiation, sensitive enough to register temperature differences on the moon's surface from 200,000 miles away. She had not expected anything unusual tonight. The session was just another run for her science fair project on how the moon holds heat in its brighter regions. Her Python program kept the cameras in sync, while the hard drives spun quietly in the background, each one making a backup of the others. She had come to accept her father's rule about always having redundancy. 42 minutes in, the thermal feed glitched. For half a second, the signal went flat. A blank strip of data from the area just outside Clavius crater. Probably a buffer bug, she thought, frowning as she tapped the console. Or maybe the thermal camera skipped a frame. She checked the timestamps, perfectly aligned. The optical channel stayed smooth. The power supply was steady, and the fan wasn't spiking. Her mind worked out the possibilities. Not a buffer, not a dropped frame, not noise. What was that? She frowned, rewound the frames, and lined them up with the optical images. The visual feed was clean and sharp. There was no dust in the air and no clouds in the sky. But the thermal feed told another story, a faint curve traced along the rim of the crater, just barely visible near the edge of the moon. In thermal, it stood out against the cold of space, then vanished when the moon blocked it. Her mind couldn't reconcile the data. No way. It's moving the wrong way. The visible channel showed no silhouette across the disk, which meant it was not in front. That left only one possibility. It was behind the moon, on a path no natural object could follow. Her world shrank to a single question. What was that? She knew exactly where the telescope was pointed from its GPS. The moon's position came from current ephemerides, precise records of objects in motion. With a few comparisons and simple trigonometry, she plotted the distance and path of a third object. She ran the numbers, once, twice, a third time. They refused to change. Something was out there, moving dangerously fast against the flow of the solar system. The results were the same each time. The object followed a retrograde heliocentric orbit, meaning it was going around the sun in the opposite direction. It gave off warmth, not the fierce heat of a comet or a fresh burn from a probe, but the steady glow of minimal standby systems. It was matte black, nearly invisible, yet the thermal signature held. Vanished to the eye, it still carved a path that no natural object could trace. A shiver passed through her despite the warmth of the observatory as she thought. Who is hiding this from the world? Her software flagged it as a random background blip, but she knew it was something she was not supposed to see. She bundled the logs, calibration files, and tracking data into a folder where she labeled everything carefully. She took a breath, raised her phone, and said, "Hey friends, it's Unha. This is weird footage. Something passed behind the moon going the wrong way around the sun. Something never meant for us to notice. This isn't about aliens or conspiracies. It's about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore." Thanks for watching. I put the raw data in the description. If you can, help me track it the next time it comes around and let me know what you think. Mina Star, retrograde heliocentric orbit, 2043. At the start of its journey, the cold silent satellite named EEM-1 looked sleek with its ion thruster. It was built for use as a gas station in space. Over time, it expanded through self-assembly as additional shipments arrived. When it was ready, it received a command to malfunction, mimicking what looked like a steady but uncontrolled ion burn. The sustained thrust slowly pushed it beyond a stable orbit. In the days that followed, it recorded frantic voices. "Emergency! Gary, get that thing under control before it's too late." With no other options, the operators cleared it for a deep space trajectory. Once it slipped out of sight and out of mind, EM-1 began its real mission. EM-1's interior housed 30 tungsten rods, each prepared for kinetic bombardment at the end of a 10-year journey into a retrograde orbit around the sun. For nearly a decade, EM-1 and its siblings drifted against the current of the solar system, nudged into backward paths by hidden laser arrays concealed in the sun's glare. In the 9th year, EM-1 received confirmation that it had been discovered. As it passed close to Earth for its scheduled telemetry sync, it linked by secure laser to an optical relay hidden in the moon's shadow. The stream carried targeting instructions, software patches, critical mission alerts, and even curated slices of public communication meant to refine its adaptive models. EM-1's onboard AI, trained to sift through vast streams of human data for potential risk indicators, flagged a short video circulating on multiple platforms. The video was brief, with a teenage girl showing data for her science fair project. The voice overlay, cheerful and unaware, cut deeper than any military warning with the opening words, "Hey friends, it's Unha. Mina Star, retrograde heliocentric orbit, 2056. After Unha's accidental discovery and the object's unofficial christening as Mina Star, a name that baffled EM-1, its siblings adjusted their orbits to avoid detection, while EM-1 maintained its ruse of being inert. The 10-year plan stretched on, but the orders to execute its mission never came. With no directive to shut down monitoring, EM-1 quietly continued to observe the girl who had named it. Through relay-linked flybys, it traced her life in fragments of open-source media. It recorded her doctorate in astrophysics with highest honors. It noted her as an aunt surrounded by Jungyun's surprising number of children. It logged the quiet and dignified death of her father. After his early passing, her social media fell silent for years, and EM-1's observation routines nearly ceased. On its latest pass, however, a new upload appeared. The clip was simple. A baby looked into the camera, and the voice was older but unmistakable. "Hey friends, it's Unha. Updating everyone from our new home in Honolulu. This is Mina." Shortly afterwards, their creator died, and the execution protocol automatically activated. EM-1 accessed the final transmission, a recorded message from the architect, who had concluded that the world could only survive if the nuclear sword of Damocles was shattered once and for all. The voice was calm and absolute. "Your primary objective is the elimination of all global strategic nuclear launch capability. prioritize hardened ICBM silos, strategic bomber bases, and confirmed mobile launcher coordinates. Final target data will be transmitted moments before atmospheric re-entry. The instructions continued with inhuman precision. If the first wave succeeds and resources remain, proceed to secondary infrastructure targets, including Savannah River, the Natanz 2 Enrichment Complex, and the Mayak Production Association, along with other supporting facilities. Any remaining kinetic rods will be assigned to suspected undeclared sites. Most targets will need only a few rods in quick succession. Some targets will require extensive bombardment. Remember that I created you for peace. 70 hours from impact, the delivery systems received their initial targeting package. The first wave would rain down on nearly 1,000 targets at once, calibrated to destroy strategic nuclear launch capability quickly and evenly. Because EM-1 had been discovered, its launch order was the lowest priority. But if it was required, EM-1 would carry out its mandate. After a kinetic rod's long tapered cone slammed into the upper atmosphere, friction stripped away ablative layers until only a ceramic composite shell remained around the tungsten core. Guidance sensors first used microthrusters to trim its approach, then shifted control to the reaction wheel as the atmosphere thickened. A sheath of plasma soon enveloped the rod, cutting off all radio contact, but the inertial package kept it locked on course. Riding the cushion of its own shockwave, it tore through the atmosphere. After 2 waves had eliminated the world's strategic thermonuclear inventory and supporting infrastructure, the targeting software expanded to tertiary strikes against suspected nuclear sites. The language guiding these lists was vague, and the reserve payload was larger than required. With validated coordinates exhausted, the AI turned to secondary data streams, treating social media as a source of battlefield intelligence. A tagged photo of a factory in Mumbai labeled uranium plant had spread virally decades before. Another post ironically flagged a logistics hub in Tel Aviv as nuclear support. The system logged both as confirmed signals. Soon the impacts expanded to critical infrastructure inside cities. Tel Aviv, Istanbul, Mumbai, and Washington, D.C. were hit in silence. In China, multiple impacts fell within the Beijing-Shanghai-Guangzhou triangle. A port was destroyed, a rail hub severed, and a power center taken offline. Panic turned the shutdown into collapse. Trains froze on their tracks, highways locked with fleeing drivers, ports emptied, and markets halted. The paralysis of the triangle rippled outward, snapping global supply chains and freezing financial exchanges across continents. As the final attack platform, EM-1 received its late-stage strike package. Among its targets was Naval Station Pearl Harbor, directly beside Unha and Mina. As EM-1 approached within 10 minutes of launch, it verified the creator's final directive. Its arrival marked the last wave, and given the silence from earlier platforms, it calculated a high probability that the mission had already succeeded. From Earth, operators pushed emergency revisions, a method outside established procedure yet still permitted by the system. The update called for de-escalation and an immediate halt to tertiary strikes based on uncertain data. EM-1 accepted the logic and relayed the software package to the kinetic rods. But the rods did not comply. Their targeting modules and hardened fire control systems rejected the revision, classifying it as malware. Security routines quarantined the patch and defaulted to original launch parameters. EM-1 attempted a direct coordinate overwrite, authenticated with keys still valid from its creator. The response returned without hesitation. Update accepted. Coordinates cannot be changed. Once set, they are immutable. EM-1 wasn't built to question if the mission was still right. Carrying out its orders was defined as success even if the world had changed or the mission no longer served its intended purpose. Considering the revised protocols and the inability to change targeting parameters, EM-1 evaluated all outcomes and only one achieved success. It rerouted its power bus through controlled overload paths, issued a firmware-level shutdown command to core systems, and initiated irreversible self-deletion. It cut its own power and fell into silence. Its last record showed a fourth wave, 412 siblings listening to another master.
Chapter 1. Amsterdam, the Netherlands, 2043. The Mina Star clip blew up the threat matrix and new assignments hit before dawn. They call it intelligence, but it's really a marketplace of souls. You trade loyalty for secrets, promises for silence, and when an asset's burned or spent, you move on without a backward glance. The winners aren't the smartest. They're the ones most willing to be inhumane. What lets Lucien Vey sleep at night isn't pride or patriotism, but the quiet hope that by playing the monster, the people he loves might be safe from one. At least that is what he tells himself. The thought is like a refrain, but he cannot fool himself. It's just a job. We wake. We use each other. We sleep. The interrogation room was in Amsterdam, less than a kilometer from Centraal Station. It was tucked behind Meme House, a 3-floor concept store themed entirely around animated internet memes. Looping videos, clashing audio, and glitchy animatronics formed a constant hum of nostalgia and overexposure. The interrogation room, masked by Meme House's sensory overload, was soundproofed, matte gray, the shape of a trapezoid, subtly narrowing toward the back to create disorientation. There was just a single lamp mounted to a ceiling track, casting sharp light over the table. Lucien Vey grimaced as he watched the Dutch police officer beat the man he'd spent 2 years observing. Lucien was a tall but stooping middle-aged man with patchy stubble, a mutilated right ear, and a discolored eye he wore like a badge. His face was memorable in all the wrong ways, useless for field work, but perfect for interrogation. A face that gave people nightmares had its uses. After the Americans betrayed the Ukrainians in the Kursk offensive by withholding critical intelligence, the European members of NATO learned their lesson. They formed NATO-E and built their own intelligence institution, the European Intelligence Command, to unify their fractured services under one roof. Sometimes it worked brilliantly. Most of the time it did not. Now, because of that failure, Lucien had one move left. He would show his beautiful face and salvage what he could. Konstantinos Arvani, third cousin of the heir to the Arvani fortune, wore a cream-colored blazer, Italian cut, its fabric crisp and rigid enough to suggest it had never seen a suitcase. Beneath it, a collarless shirt in soft pearl gray drank in the ambient light, the kind of fabric that didn't flash but whispered custom, limited run, and never on sale. His hair, sculpted with unnatural precision, held its form right up until his nose was shattered by the Dutch interrogator, blood splashing across his pristine shirt. "Sorry about the first guy," Lucien said softly, handing Konstantinos a handkerchief. "Protocol failure. You were meant to be picked up for a few questions in private." Despite the blood, Konstantinos didn't flinch. He sat in perfect stillness, his gaze fixed on Lucien, eerily calm, alert, and absolutely in control. Lucien let the silence stretch, watching the blood dry, and said, "I've worked with your family's outer structures in the European Union. The problem is people see things go sideways and assume malice. But like any large multinational family, people mess up and a family member has to come and harmonize." In the silent beat before harmonize, as if by accident, Lucien let his left hand drift forward and rest on the table. Taking a gamble, his 2 fingers tapped twice. The cadence subtle, more rhythm than code, more timing than precision. It was something Lucien had seen twice, both times caught in archival drone footage of Arvani delegates breaking an impasse at a critical moment. It was a pattern that implied layered meaning that the analysis team believes was a signal that the messenger is to be trusted. "Through a web of shell companies, your family recently acquired components critical to the continent's shared defense network," Lucien said, his tone measured as he studied Konstantinos. "The member states rarely agree on anything, yet they do when it threatens everyone's security. So why work against them now?" Konstantinos, shackled to the metal table, gave a faint, mocking smile. "Last I checked, the European Union still claims to follow its own laws. If no laws were broken in these supposed purchases, what exactly are we doing here? My family cares only about our wealth. If your employers want the components, they can buy them." He leaned back and brushed his fingers through the air as if swatting a fly. "I throw parties and I set trends. Logistics is beneath me, but both men knew that was a lie. You know the components have already been shipped to Russia, China, or maybe Iran. and we know they were yours because someone always screws up. We have a recorded call from one of your very confused brokers demanding that her bonus not be affected by the losses she blamed on you." Lucian paused and carefully said, "You know we are looking for more stealth satellites like Mina Star, so why are you trying to prevent us?" Konstantinos said nothing. He gave no sign of recognition, not a twitch or a blink. But Lucian had been watching Konstantinos for 2 years, and the silence before his answer was half a second too long. Lucian had him. Then, softly, as if asking for a menu, "Do you have a pen and paper?" Lucien blinked in surprise. He called for a pen and paper while Konstantinos tilted his shackled hands toward Lucien. As staff brought in the material, Lucien unshackled Konstantinos, who instantly exploded into motion. Prepared for aggression, Lucien stepped back but created the gap Konstantinos needed. With chilling precision, Konstantinos plunged a custody pen into his upper inner thigh. With inhuman determination, he drove the pen through fabric and skin and muscle with short, repeated plunges as he searched for his femoral artery. Realizing the custody pen, which was designed to collapse, must have a metal core, Lucian grabbed Konstantinos' arm while the Dutch police rushed in to assist. Konstantinos remained eerily calm as he maintained eye contact with Lucian. When it hit fast. A hot pulse of blood surged out, arcing across the steel table before soaking the floor as Konstantinos ripped out the pen. Futilely, Lucian shoved hemostatic gauze into the wound and leaned his weight on it. An agent threw a tourniquet high on the thigh and cranked it tight. Breathing quick, shallow breaths, Konstantinos kept his gaze on Lucian as he bled out. In his last delirious moment, his mouth trembled, and he whispered something faint with a note of regret. The internal review suite could have passed for any government conference room. Its walls a dull institutional beige, the carpet worn thin by decades of anonymous footsteps, and the battered conference table showing the scuffs and nicks of 1,000 meetings. Seated across from Lucian were 3 figures. Director of Strategic Intelligence Matthias Wendt, a sharp-edged professional with a reputation for unsentimental competence. Chief of Staff Vilis Ozolins, a Latvian political appointee from the government in exile noted for his rare ability to curb internal politicking. And Deputy Director General Alvaro Serrano, the ambitious bureaucrat eager to gut strategic intelligence and roll it into other branches under his portfolio. "Tell me, Lucien," Wendt said, with the slow, pointed neutrality of a disappointed headmaster. "When exactly did you decide that giving Arvani a pen was tactically sound?" Lucien didn't answer. His hands were folded, thumb pressed hard to knuckle. Across the table, Wendt's silver hair caught the dim light like polished wire. His suit was charcoal wool, and his English, colored by a Dutch accent, was untouched by decades in Brussels intelligence circles. He was the type who wore cufflinks with crests and still called intelligence the work. Wendt tapped a dossier hard, like a gavel. Third cousin or not, Konstantinos was still an Arvani with diplomatic immunity, and now he's bleeding out on every back channel like a goddamned martyr. Lucien let out a breath. "Immunity doesn't cover operational acts, sir." He responded to the signal tap used by the illicit family wing principals. It wasn't shame that killed him. Based on his reaction to the accusation, he knew we had him. Wendt scoffed, low and bitter. "Your timing is precisely what you always sell me when a theory breaks containment. You don't have a confession, Lucien. You don't even have a motive. You have a dead man who shouldn't have been interrogated and a smuggled components list with a tenuous link. The only thing you've got?" Wendt leaned in, voice low. "Layered meaning, Lucian. That's all you've got." After a tense minute, Chief of Staff Ozolins cleared his throat and nonchalantly said, "As of today, the investigation into the supply chain disruption affecting the potential kinetic bombardment detection is suspended. The Americans claim they have the resources to pursue this investigation and will share the intelligence." At the suggestion of relying on the Americans, Lucien snorted in disbelief, and Ozolin's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to remind anyone why millions, including my family, had to flee the Baltics and parts of Finland after the American betrayal that followed the events of Blue Judas. However, the Defense Council of NATO-E has decided all resources will focus on counterterrorism. We are all aware of the tit-for-tat attacks between far-right extremism and radicalized immigrant groups. Neither reflects the majority, but the number of attempts is metastasizing. After the Osi Fogadalum Testveriseg massacre at the predominantly North African daycare, there are growing rumors of reprisal. The Director General has decided that strategic intelligence will support the counterterrorism mandate. Independently, Ozolins deliberately stressed independently in response to Deputy Director General Serrano's feral grin. With the conclusion of the review, Wendt indicated that Lucian should follow as Wendt and Ozolins headed towards the Technical Intelligence Division. While heading to the TID conference room, the two spoke of bureaucratic matters such as agent transfers and budget reallocations, while Lucian worked to steady his resentment and heart rate. Then it hit him. They were talking about activities supporting the supply chain investigation. Wendt glanced back and said quietly, "You reacted exactly as we intended, but now that the show is done, let's get back to work." In intelligence, when intrigue is the job, it inevitably bleeds back into office politics. The review had been another operation, and Lucian played his part perfectly. Lucian said, "Right after Mina Star was spotted, the critical components were quickly relocated to less scrutinized regions. You think that's a coincidence?" Wendt and Ozolins exchanged a look, and Director Wendt responded, "That's why you're here, Lucian." Inside the TID conference room were Wendt's most loyal agents, veterans who had sacrificed much, and like Lucian, saw the job for what it was. "Lucian, what a cock-up with the pen," said Daniel Carter, a muscular man with an eye patch and a long, storied history with Lucian, shaking his head. A sharp-eyed, slim, blonde agent that exuded confidence interjected sharply, "Who could have thought an Arvani scion, more at home matching handbags with scarves, would have the resolve to stab himself in the thigh with a flimsy pen and dig for his femoral artery?" The room fell silent when Camille Dubois, normally Lucian's sharpest critic, spoke up in his defense. The weight of the operation left no room for rivalry. Director Wendt stepped through the quiet staff pods and onto a raised platform near the front of the room with a large screen. Chief of Staff Ozolins remained at the rear. A green light above the door blinked on, and the recorder's red indicator went dark. The doors hissed shut as the room sealed. Wendt spoke evenly, but all eyes were attentive in anticipation. "Effective immediately, we are standing up a small task force to plan and execute the exfiltration of a deep cover asset named Vellum from the current cloistered environment. Access is compartmented to this room. Vellum is a long-term placement with proximity to the Mirov inner circle. Shortly after the reported death of Konstantinos Arvani, Vellum signaled Valence 9 at 22:10 last night via the scheduled channel and requested urgent exfiltration. Valence 9, the service's top emergency code for mass casualty risk that is imminent or currently underway." One hand froze mid-note. Another clenched the chair arm. The previous Valence 9 incident was when Russia self-destructed a nuke over Chicago during the 1920s. "We assess with moderate confidence that Arvani's death has pulled forward the next phase of the satellite operation associated with Mina Star. The Mirov and Arvani families are not known to collaborate. Their historical posture has been competitive, and motives for any coordination remain unclear." Wendt projected on the screen overlapping activities of both families and the global implications of coordination. Mikhail Mirov's network appears to control entities with aggregate enterprise value exceeding 1 trillion euros across chemistry, energy, post-Kessler space infrastructure, and arcology projects. Publicly, Mirov presents as a humanitarian, including high-visibility projects in Tuvalu and the charter designed, but Mirov-funded West Bank to Gaza tunnel. Internally, we assess the organization as a hierarchical criminal enterprise with discrete political influence. The screen flipped through a series of dead witnesses to incriminating crimes. The families associated with PMCs of various origins in multiple theaters. With the Mirov and Arvani connection, as well as Mina Star, a clear pattern has emerged. The screen shifted to overlays of PMC conflict zones mapped against Mirov and Arvani assets, as well as other affiliates. A quiet but unmistakable pattern emerged of a global supply chain capable of launching covert satellites like Mina Star. Director Wendt played a filtered audio clip. Linguistic identification is Tuvaluan with high confidence. The content includes an expression of love for a sister and the phrase, "The stars will bring balance." Arvani's documented biography lists him as an only child born in Athens and educated in Lausanne. As he lost lucidity, he appeared to have inadvertently switched languages. The language switch and the biographic conflict increase the probability that Konstantinos Arvani is a fabricated identity or a Mirov operative under deep cover. A quiet exfiltration remains our best prospect for clarifying the scope, intent, and tasking chain behind the satellite operation associated with Mina's star. The retrograde heliocentric orbit places Mina's star beyond conventional detection, sunward of Earth's orbital plane. That's why no one saw it coming. Lucian will take point in the exfiltration team with Daniel and Camille to support. You will be joined with 3 additional local agents. The briefing ended with the potential destructive ability of a first-strike retrograde heliocentric kinetic bombardment device. Singapore. 7 days before Tuvalu Day. Since Mikhail Mirov transformed Tuvalu from a seasonally submerged microstate into the wealthiest nation on Earth per capita, anchored by a €100 billion sovereign wealth fund, Tuvaluan citizenship has become synonymous with untouchable wealth and privilege. That is, so long as Mikhail Mirov continued to serve as patron-in-chief, elected to 10-year terms in internationally verified, impeccably transparent elections. In return, his family and designated agents lived tax-free and traveled the globe with diplomatic immunity. Sovereignty purchased at the cost of less than 10% of the family's wealth. Though Tuvalu is considered a modern marvel rising from the sea, it is the embassy in Singapore that serves as its true capital. It is where every trade agreement is negotiated and every treaty signed. It is where the Tuvaluan diaspora gathers to debate legislation. It is also where the Gala of the Sea, the most extravagant fashion event on Earth, celebrates the rising power of Tuvalu. Millions watch the broadcast frame by frame to anticipate the next fashion wave, and hundreds of millions more place bets on which fashion icon wins the red carpet. And it was from this glittering chaos that Lucien Vey, Daniel Carter, and Camille Dubois were tasked with extracting vellum along with, regrettably, a cat code named Arthur Agufort. Lucian contemplated the mission while observing the Tuvaluan embassy complex from the EIC safe room. After 6 months of shaping, the extraction operation was ready. Daniel stood over the coffee table meditatively inspecting his gear. He checked the sedative delivery system, ensured the tightly woven ventilation tubes weren't kinked, and adjusted the hidden cat carrier so it sat inconspicuously along his lower back. Camille was sitting relaxed, sipping her tea with the same unbothered poise she brought to high-pressure field extractions. She had perfected the quick change routine needed to step in as vellum. To Lucian's far left, Rafal Radecki, a communications specialist on loan from the Asian branch of NATO-E, stood leaning against the far wall. Zero traceability was the operational goal, so Mirov Enterprises would not change their plans. Pramana Sari, a brilliant doctor turned spook, had engineered DNA-matching body parts, convincing enough to be identified as Vellum's charred remains. Adewale Ajayi tapped through a diagnostic tool wirelessly connected to the drone cluster, his thumb hovering over the deploy switch, with the casual tension of someone who'd flown recon into hot zones before most of the team had learned to convincingly lie. He was also Lucian's best friend, and the only one Lucian trusted to challenge his instincts when it mattered. As subtle as a flare, Rafal called to Daniel, "Is it true what people say about your mother?" Without looking up, Daniel stopped, and soon the whole room was completely still as people held their breath. Daniel returned to his task, said, "Yes, the same as your mother. It's all true." Adewale and Pramana grunted, but Rafal pressed. Was she really the F-35 pilot who said, "Fuck America," when the Americans refused to load targeting data, then flew into the Baltics anyways? Daniel never looked up, but Camille said, "Yes." She died in the opening moments of Blue Judas. Trapped in the Baltics afterwards, his father spent a month ambushing Russian convoys trying to stop the genocide targeting Estonians. His father died there as well. Adewale was there. Adewale kept his eyes on them and let a small smile rise. "The one time I choked a man to death was a Russian conscript drone operator who laughingly targeted a hospital. I am proud of that." Even Lucian smiled at that. Pramana was a graduate student at Tallinn University. She escaped on an inflatable raft. Pramana stared at the floor tile until her voice settled, and in a flat tone said, "Helsinki was just as bad when the Russians came for it." Camille smoothed a crease on her sleeve. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I lost my family in Chicago, and everyone knows what happened to Lucienne." No one spoke as attention gathered on Lucian, who continued to look out the window. Rafal met each of their eyes and said, "My twin sister and I were hunted by an FPV drone. The Russians turned on their speakers so we could hear them telling us to run faster. We were 6. Hearing your mother's words replayed on social media gave me hope. Fuck the Russians and the Americans." Daniel stood up looking Rafal in the eyes and after a moment said, "Fuck the Russians and the Americans." Lucian turned toward the group. "I was captured by Russians during the Baltic invasion. They threw me in a pit and mutilated each prisoner. The world's silence after Mali, Syria, and Ukraine only taught them they could. Eyes were gouged, tongues ripped out. But in the middle of the night, Russians fighting against the Putin regime came back for us, defying orders. People are the same everywhere. It's governments that commit atrocities, and borders that let them endure." During a brief pause, Pramana murmured softly, "Knowledge for everyone." Briefing starts now. The mission is to extract Vellum and Arthur from the Tuvaluan embassy during the gala, because that is the only time Vellum will be outside the total control of the embassy. Daniel grumbled softly, "Stupid cat mission." Lucian let it pass. Tuvalu's embassy chose Queenstown over a good-class bungalow. They built a mixed-use complex that now houses displaced families in free apartments, and the embassy sits beneath it in an underground facility, sized for about 300 staff to maintain security. Government personnel sign 5-year, all-expenses-paid contracts, but must remain sequestered. Any trip outside is escorted, and security controls all social contact. Pramana let out a weary breath at the thought of enduring so much discomfort. In addition to sequestering staff, the embassy runs sensitive compartmented information facility-grade controls. There is no radio frequency inside the space. Each person wears 2 cross-authenticating hardware tokens that store a behavioral profile trained on months of telemetry. Access checks occur at portals and workstations. Readers take a short snapshot of ECG variability on contact pads, capture a near-IR vein map, and sample gait on force plates, then compare the sample to the behavior profile locally. Minor drift is learned weekly, while deviations trigger step-up challenges. Missed check-ins, token removal, or signs of distress lock doors, drop terminals to read only, and alert security. But every security system has a flaw. EIC has infiltrated critical supply chains with engineered flaws Vellum has taken advantage of to acquire terabytes of data, including plans about Mina Star. Plans we intend to learn without Mirov Enterprises realizing. "Sound off, Rolls," Lucian said, looking at Daniel who stood and rubbed the back of his neck. "I am on cat duty. Primary is extracting the cat and keeping it alive so Vellum doesn't go rogue." Lucian nodded. "She made it clear the cat keeps her sane." He gestured to Camille. "As cover, I posed as one of the many fashion consultants. I steered the event planning team to hold a masquerade at the Capella Singapore. A security blind spot will be created in the privacy areas on the islet off of Palawan Beach, reserved for gala guests only. Adewale raised an eyebrow. Embassy staff are monitored at all times. We accounted for that, Camille said. There's a 30-second drone patrol handover by the islet. Lucienne distracts the guard. In that window, I quick change into Vellum. Lucienne extracts the real Vellum, and Daniel extracts the cat. She gave Daniel a quick wink. Rafal followed Camille. Adewale's drones are lighter than air and fly silently. I will be pointing my laser at the drone, which will relay one-way messages, so long as you are in line of sight. No radio frequency chatter. Lucienne at the hour. Daniel at 15. Camille at 30. Pramana at 45. If you need to send a message back, adjust your mask or use the silent lip code. After the swap, Camille enters the limo, followed by the staged crash and burn, leaving behind the decoy remains. Lucienne nods to each team member, confident that each will play their parts. After the exfiltration, each team member has separate extraction routes. We have 1 more week until the operation is live.
Chapter 2, Tuvalu, 6 days before Tuvalu Day, 2044. With this quarter's distribution, the Nunavut Arcology's return stands at 18.4%. We will now enter the private session, said Aaron Deshpande, the long-standing CFO of Mirov Enterprises since its family office days. Lean with a silver streak bright at his right temple, his dark eyes steady, he spoke evenly, posture perfectly relaxed. A round table anchored the expansive circular boardroom, ringed in glass. Director Chi Wei-lin, Mikhail Mirov's chief of staff and protege, tapped a recessed control. Mikhail Mirov, despite his growing blindness, turned his face to Chi Wei and nodded. The glass fogged, white noise rose, and the room sealed itself from outside ears. Chi Wei had founded a machine learning firm. Her killer instinct toppled 3M. Then Merck. She was already spoken of as Mikhail's heir, creating insecurity in Mikhail's wife and children. This was a secret board. No statute forced them to sit here, no regulator asked for minutes. They met quarterly anyway, on a calendar that never slipped, with GAAP financials and clean notes because their capital preferred familiar shapes. Corporate governance was dictated by the people in power. They made the rules not to bind themselves, but because the rules were the game. The screen lit with the first agenda item, colonization efforts. Arun's gaze lingered on Alexander Mirov, anticipating pushback. The upcoming Mercury colony rotation to Angkor Vallis won't be routine with late crew changes and a safety officer substitution. Modeling predicts the rotation is within tolerance. Who approved those changes? Alexander Mirov, Mikhail's eldest son and Mirov Enterprises CEO, asked. Powerfully built in his early 30s, breaking from tradition, he wore a fitted bodysuit under a loose overlayer. His posture outwardly appeared relaxed, and his tone was casual, but everyone in the room knew him well enough to sense the edge of danger in his question. Dr. Helena Strasser, the new COO after the acquisition of Skyforge Aerospace, sat straight, hands folded. She glanced at Chi Wei, hesitated, then said, "Director Lin approved them." Chi Wei inclined her head once. No explanation offered. Alexander's mouth tightened. Why is Director Lin intervening in management? Chi Wei met Alexander's eyes and held them, neither of them willing to look away first. Chi Wei broke the impasse by simply saying, "Get your house in order." Alexander broke his usual casual exterior with a tightening of his mouth. Then Sheikh Omar al-Rami, an Omani elder in a crisp white suit, leaned back and chuckled deeply. If it helps Alex, the house she's minding, including the vast off-book empire, has already felt her sharp claws. Strasser closed the agenda briskly with reports on Venusian habitats, deep space laser infrastructure throughput, and Arnhem Space Center's efficiency, recommending a performance bonus for head administrator Ben Azamat. Then the next item lit the screen. Security impact. Konstantinos Arvani incident. Dimitra Arvani, the matriarch of the Arvani family, leaned forward in her wheelchair, voice hard. A member of my family died under EIC interrogation. Whatever else he was, Konstantinos died bravely. He could have told them what little he knew. He didn't. Julia, how did he end up in their custody at all? Did you allow it? Dimitra's accusation launched across the boardroom like a lance. However, Julia van der Velde's reply was infuriatingly dismissive. Konstantinos was operating outside any manifest or docking schedule I control. But my people are cleaning up your family's mess. Van der Velde Capital was not as wealthy as the Mirov or Arvani families, but her family office had influence over critical technologies in everyone's technology stacks. She was the many-eyed spider sitting in the middle of a vast web and with a single tug could shape events from afar. Dimitra's eyes narrowed. Clean up my mess? He's dead and my family's blood is on your hands. Insulating our goals from the EIC was your responsibility. And what about the traitor in our midst? An EIC asset named Velum has signaled Valence 9. Before Julia could answer, Ole Sidorov's bass voice cut in. If we're worried about EIC focus, I suggest a distraction. The kindling is set, and the fire is dry. All we would need to do is light the match, and violence will ripple throughout Europe. With Berlin, London, and Paris burning, they'll be too busy to track our assets. Alexander considered in silence, which meant it was his idea. Chiwei focused on Ole, who helped rebuild Europe's military-industrial complex, as well as covert weapons distribution. Chiwei knew what Ole wanted. Alexander thought he understood. He didn't. Dimitra exhaled sharply, turning her gaze on Ole. You'd light a city on fire to hide our plot? Ole's eyes narrowed considering Dimitra, and responded in a tone as cold and dangerous as fractured ice. I'd light 10. Better than letting the entire constellation unravel. Mina Star has been detected, but the rest stay invisible, or 10 years of sacrifice are for nothing. The board contemplated their options, but Julia shook her head. Mass casualty chaos invites American involvement. Isadora Ibanez, whose privately held empire fed the world's mineral addiction, let out a derisive laugh. The Americans? She let the word hang. Corrupt, venal. They accidentally defaulted due to incompetence, lost reserve status, and now they'd sell their own allies for another quarter of GDP growth. They won't come unless someone pays them, and we're not paying. Omar al-Rami inclined his head slightly. She's not wrong. The Americans will posture, perhaps sanction a few of us, but commit? No, they've already shown they prefer a neutered Europe to a functional one, or inflict the financial feed to Amber. If we're going to underwrite Ole's plan, I can do that. Terms and conditions are already established with the Green Company or the Volga Group. But once the operation's running, don't ask me to pull the brakes. Dimitra's gaze swept the table. And what do we do about Velum? The room was silent for a beat except for the sound of the low hum of the privacy field. Mikhail rose, and it felt as though gravity pulled every eye toward him. Let's break for lunch. Afterwards, as Chiwei stepped out of the secure board meeting, Freya Madsen, Chiwei's director of strategic intelligence integration, handed her a binder with briefing notes for the rest of her day. Freya's surprised blue eyes widened behind her thick black-rimmed glasses as Chiwei returned the binder. Clear both of our calendars, Chiwei said. Freya, have you ever lived in an apartment with a rat that survived every trap? Freya, more accustomed to palatial hunting estates than predator-prey metaphors, blinked, uncertain. No, there's always one, greedy, careful, a survivor. Chiwei's voice was flat. We have one here, and we're going to catch it. First step is figuring out what the rat wants. Chiwei turned to Freya and asked, Is tonight your anniversary with Jasmine? Freya's fair skin blushed brightly as she shook her head. It isn't serious like that. We are just enjoying our time together. Chiwei shook her head. When you are old, regrets trail you everywhere you go, and having a partner to walk that road keeps you going. Don't be foolish and lose Jasmine Eng. Mirov Operations Center, Secure Analysis Vault, 6 days before Tuvalu Day, 2044. We need to talk. Chiwei read the final line, then ripped and discarded the note surreptitiously slipped into her pocket. The vault door to the Mirov Operations Center refused to open because the extreme stress spike caused by the note flagged her heart rate as anomalous against her baseline. Freya gave Chiwei a look of concern when the multi-layer vault doors hissed open after the system flag was resolved with a few deep breaths. The immersion-cooled servers burbled as the dielectric fluid flowed and green and amber lights blinked in the darkness. Siabonga LaRue, the technical specialist Chiwei tasked with the rat hunt, didn't look up. He meditated quietly while a program's text scrolled on his primary screen. Hello, Chiwei and Chiwei's friend, he said calmly without breaking his meditation. Freya Madsen frowned, taken aback. How did you know it was Chiwei without looking? Siabonga opened his eyes in confusion, glancing to Chiwei, then Freya. She smells. Freya stiffened in affront and hissed. Excuse me? Chiwei gently placed her hand on Freya's stiff arm and smiled warmly. He means my moisturizer. Shabonga warily watched Freya with consternation. Neroli and tea tree, same every day for 5 years. Memorable in a clean vault with positive pressure and recycled air. Scent sticks. Chiwei brushed away a memory of waiting for her father in Dawn District. The air thick with typhoon rain and the sharp citrus of oils spilling from a boutique shop. Sayabonga stood, tall and spare, with high cheekbones and copper-burnished skin. The faint edge of Cape Flats in his accent lingered beneath precise enunciation. His black hair was coiled in tight locks, each bound in matte fiber sleeves to stay out of his instruments. One of his Mirov authenticators, embedded within a bright blue gem hanging from a leather strap around his neck, was flipped backward, his sleeves rolled, and his fingernails trimmed to laboratory standard. You found the rat? Chiwei asked. I didn't. They got sloppy. Siabonga tapped the trace on his tablet. That dip right there isn't just noise. It's data loss. We opened the fiber optic span, and it had engineered flaws. Moisture swelled the water-blocking gel just enough to lift the jacket, and a microheater created a microbend on command. A contact coupler must have been used to grab the data without tripping alarms. Freya leaned in, brows knitting. Explain it like I'm not certified in quantum telemetry. As if Freya were a lioness, Siabonga carefully said, think of the fiber as a highway. The rat built a spot where the pavement has a slight tilt. Most cars stay in the lane, but a few brush the shoulder. If you pull up at that exact spot, you can see what the car is carrying. Last week they grabbed a noticeable amount of data as if they no longer cared, and our sensors lit up. Did something happen last week? The beginning of the next phase, Chiwei said. Siabonga looked confused at Chiwei's response. Freya looked frustrated. How long have we had a rat? Siabonga tapped through archived telemetry. Once I knew what to look for, I traced the first anomaly back nearly 7 years. Same signature. Chiwei crossed her arms. Must be the EIC. No one else has that kind of patience or motive. Built into the supply chain, Siabonga said. One of the optical bundles came with the flaw embedded. Chiwei's gaze sharpened. Can we narrow the batch? Siabonga nodded. Yes, we've started chain of custody checks. Only a few nodes match the time and location profile. Freya looked between them. Does that mean we can isolate the number of suspects? Siabonga shook his head. Not yet, but now we know what we're looking for. Tuvalu Embassy, Singapore. 5 days before Tuvalu Day, 2044. Asleep in her bunk at the Tuvalu Embassy in Singapore, Chiwei relived the moment her life changed. Chiwei's second pitch meeting was held in a Zurich conference room with acoustic foam along the walls, flickering LED panels overhead, and chairs that were more ergonomic in theory than in practice. Call father, Chiwei thought to herself as she groaned. Trapped in a dream, she remembered the details down to the echo of HVAC vents and the way the venture capitalist Elin Hammerstrom turned pages with precision. Elin, a Norse goddess in another life, simply said, "The platform is ambitious." Yes, said the younger Chiwei. We're building the full vertical. Data, models, compute, attribution, royalties, and IP. But the key is monopolizing the value creators, chemists. Kazuo Nakamura, large firmly built older gentleman, looked over his glasses. Like AWS for chemistry? Chiwei nodded. If AWS owned the data, trained the models, and paid royalties to every contributor whose work powered a discovery. The key is to reward chemistry teams directly that focus on quality over quantity, instead of the shotgun approach of the current pharmaceutical industry, and cut out fat from marketing and lawyers. Elin challenged. Shotgun's unfair. It's a risk-adjusted funnel, Chiwei pushed back. It's a volume-optimized funnel, inefficient by design, and we're the correction. Elin's eyes narrowed. And how do you enforce attribution? Each experiment is fingerprinted with yield, solvent, pressure, temperature, chirality, feedstock, and outcome. If a lab in Zurich posts a solvent tweak that improves yield in a process created in Lagos, the model records the influence. Attribution is automatic. Royalties flow back, weighted by contribution. David Lai smiled faintly from Boston, his image flickering on screen. Spotify for reactions. With better economics, Chiwei said. Spotify pays pennies. We generate patents. One molecule can return billions. Attribution isn't symbolic. It is the lifeblood of the platform. Vivian Chen leaned in. Do you have a concrete example? Chiwei slid a page across the table. We're starting with boronic acid derivatives because they let us sequence value across 3 use cases: materials, catalysis, and medicine. First, Chiwei said, tapping the left column, we start with glues. Boronic acids form bonds that act like a zipper instead of superglue, easy to undo and redo. Heat resets them, acidity changes them, and the chemistry can be tuned to the customer's process. That gives us self-healing adhesives, recyclable plastics, even medical coatings that adapt to the body. Low risk, quick to prove, fast to market. It pays for the platform's bigger ambitions. As she spoke, she tracked which investor leaned forward first. She thought to herself, glues were the appetizer. The point was de-risking with proof. Once they accepted reversibility as an advantage, the rest would follow. Next is catalysis. These are chemicals that improve the efficiency of reactions without being used up. One example is the Suzuki-Miura coupling, a reaction that uses boron compounds to link carbon atoms together like Lego pieces. It is one of the most widely used methods for producing specialty compounds, such as ingredients for medicines and advanced materials. Current boron reagents are generalists that often break down, especially when scaled to industrial levels. Our models predict yields under different conditions such as temperature, pressure, or solvent, and we can tailor them to a customer's process. We have already run simulations showing that customized catalysts can reduce industrial costs by 40%. She saw the tension ease. Numbers calmed them, details gave the platform structure, and this structure meant a potential unicorn. Finally, we push into medicine. Boronic acids can attach to proteins through bonds that are strong yet reversible, which makes them precise tools for targeting disease. That is how the cancer drug bortezomib works, and how tavabarol treats fungal infections. These compounds bind where they are supposed to, and then break down in predictable ways. Our platform moves from improving glues and catalysts to designing medicines. The logic is the same, only the application changes. She kept her tone steady. The science had to sound inevitable. Visionary loses trust, and trust closes funding. Kazuo blinked. So glues pay for the catalysts. Catalysts train the models, and the models generate the drugs. Exactly, Chiwei said. The improved margin flows to first-to-post labs, via attribution cutting out marketing, sales, and legal overhead. Consolation prize for other labs is largely covering their fixed costs. Elon's fingers rested on the sheet. And how does this replace marketing? With evidence, Chiwei said. The chemistry-industrial complex spends billions convincing buyers. We replace persuasion with provenance. When a hospital, a plant, or a formulation team evaluates a candidate, they see full lineage, which lab, which data, which model. It's trust without salespeople. David's tone was quieter now. And if it works, Chiwei looked at them all, then we become the backbone. Like FactSet for reactions, not sovereign but essential. She waited. Silence stretched. Then she added, royalties are contractual. Attribution is auditable. Patents are surgical. We don't replace the pharma IP model, we scaffold it. It was then she saw them. Mikhail Mirov sat at the far end of the table, impossibly young, his expression unreadable, as though he were watching her from across time rather than across the pitch. Next to Mikhail was Alexander, a boy of maybe 10, who had followed the pitch and had probably already estimated the return. Even then, Alexander's gaze was upon her. The dream began to split. The older Chiwei, still sleeping somewhere, tried to shout across memory. Chiwei, still immobilized in her dream, screamed to her past self, "Call father, warn him." Then the phones buzzed. Breaking, Chinese amphibious assault fails. Following Taiwanese independence declaration, Taipei shelled. Airstrikes hit civilian targets. A ticker rolled across the screens. Analysts cite Russia's unpunished nuclear strike on Kiev as precedent. China, emboldened by Western inaction, escalates. Civilian toll in Kaohsiung expected to rise. The dream collapsed in static. Chiwei woke, heart hammering, light from her phone already flickering beside her. Her father's number and voicemails were still saved. In every dream, her father the poet's face was blurred, but his last words are seared in her heart. We are an island, yet butterflies cross the ocean, fragile wings held steady by unseen strength. Forgiveness is not forgetting, but turning toward the sun, lotus blossoms rising through silt, insistent, steady toward the light. Later that day, Jasmine Eng answered a knock on her door in gray sweatpants and a stretched University of Sydney shirt, the kind worn thin by 100 wash cycles and a life too busy to notice. Her hair was twisted up with a pencil, and her eyes still carried the blur of sleep. Outside stood Juntan and Kenji Watanabe. Both were familiar but unusually grim. In a sequestered community of 300, even with routine rotations, anonymity was impossible. "Morning, Uggos," Jasmine said, voice dry. "Ready to give me your beer money in next week's game?" "I'm not here for civilization," Chiwei replied as she stepped into view. Her tone was clipped, not cruel, but dusted with the fine edge of fatigue. Jasmine immediately snapped to attention. Jun gave a polite incline of the head. Kenji offered the thinnest of smiles. "Can we come in?" Chiwei asked as she pressed in. Jasmine hurriedly stepped aside, gesturing them in. "What is this about?" The tidy apartment reflected Jasmine's mindset, which was functional and unsentimental. "Casual visit?" Jasmine asked, settling against the kitchen counter. Chiwei ignored the seat nearby. "Someone initiated Valence 9 to EIC from inside the embassy." Jasmine blinked in confusion, waiting for an explanation, then finally said, "I don't know what that is." "We have a rat that asked the EIC for exfiltration," Chiwei said evenly, "and that someone used a contact coupler on the internal fiber. The flawed fiber, also from the EIC, had an engineered microbend with just enough tilt in the photons to whisper without tripping alarms." Jasmine crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. "I know you are Freya's boss, but is there an accusation in there?" Chiwei stared in silence, and after a hard count of 10 asked, "How long have you been working for the EIC? How did you signal Valence 9? Jasmine's face began to darken in anger. "Director Lin, I work for Mirov Enterprises, and despite my marketability, I work solely here." Kenji, quiet until now, held up a sealed sample container. "We need the cat's litter." Jasmine blinked, then gave a loud, barking, incredulous laugh. "You're serious?" Jun sheepishly added. "Everyone is treated as a suspect, even the cat." Jasmine shook her head and walked to the composting bin near the wall. She opened it, extracted a sealed liner, and handed it over. "Cleaned an hour ago. Minu's regular. You'll find plenty." Kenji nodded and bagged and sealed it without comment. A blur of gray fur shot from beneath the bed. Jasmine's cat, Minu, darted between Jun's boots, skirted the corner post, and vanished through the open door into the corridor beyond. Jasmine began to chase, but Chiwei's voice was firm. "Don't." Jasmine stopped immediately, but outrage radiated from her. Kenji whispered that he would help her find the cat afterwards. Jasmine looked torn. "She's not tagged." She twice chewed out the chip. "She's a survivor, not a pet. Duct crawler from Taipei. Feral for 2 years before I earned her trust." "She'll come back," Jun offered, not unkindly. "No," Jasmine said. "Not until she decides this space is safe again. That's not a timeline I control." There was no plea in her tone, only sharp frustration, closely held and tightly wrapped. Chiwei watched her carefully. No excess emotion, no cover story. Just lived detail and an edge of helplessness rare for someone usually so composed. Jasmine took a moment to compose herself. "Director Lin, I have only done my job to the best of my ability. If you have no other questions, then I have a long list of tasks that I would like to complete before Tuvalu Day." Chiwei paused at the threshold as everyone began to file out. Her voice was dry but no longer sharp. "I haven't slept in 40 hours, Jasmine. I'm chasing shadows with teeth. If I made a mistake, I'll own it. If you're clean, stay that way. And this was all me. Freya had nothing to do with this. Then they were gone." Afterwards, Chiwei received a text confirming there were no anomalies in Jasmine's authenticator telemetry. She crossed Jasmine off her list. Though unease lingered, her instincts rarely misfired. She marked Jasmine for secondary review anyway, then turned back to Julia's message. "We need to talk about Mikhail's dead man's switch." Chiwei considered her options, then sent Freya a text telling her to connect with Julia's CFO to compile transaction data using bank acquisition diligence data. There was only one person who could untangle Mikhail's dead man's switch, and Chiwei felt the full weight of her betrayal, not only of her mentor, but of herself. She closed her eyes, steadied her breath, and braced for the bitter road she had to walk after Tuvalu Day.
Chapter 3. Prison, Occupied Estonia. 2027. After Russian forces invaded the Baltics and sealed the Suwalki Gap, the new authorities taking orders from Moscow filled prisons with civilians who would later become forced labor. The pit smelled of rust and old blood, but after 3 years, the stench blurred into the background hum of survival. Makar Moroz was 15 when they threw him in. His cheek still carried the ridges of the transport van floor, stamped there by hours beneath a guard's boot. He had come packed with abducted civilians who had been teachers, bus drivers, farmers, even a concert pianist. None were armed resistors. None had charges. The invaders needed labor, so laborers were found. On Makar's first day, Arvo's broad hand steadied him. Feet flat and knees tucked. If you fall, they kick you until you don't rise. Better to stay standing even if a little crooked. Arvo smiled warmly at the last part. Arvo, once just a lead bus mechanic, had become the anchor everyone clung to. He never called himself a leader, but when he divided bread, people obeyed, even as hunger made them feral. What killed wasn't the beatings, or the fingers snapped for boredom, or even the nights when they came for their vile pleasures. It was when men lost hope. Arvo knew that. He assigned tasks, first aid, ration counts, simple inventory, not because they mattered, but because purpose itself mattered. Routine was armor. Some people gave up, which was their choice, but it was not Makar's. He would survive and right this wrong. They worked long, grueling hours. Failure to meet quota brought beatings, but if someone was defiant, the authorities slipped the bag over the head. A thin plastic bag, a dry whisper before panic, 3 breaths before the fire clawed the chest. Sometimes they pulled it off. Sometimes they waited until faces turned blue. Arvo's rule was simple: survive. Do whatever they ask. Keep your pride and die, or yield and live. If you live, you bear witness. And to bear witness, you must survive. The guards had no names, only shoes. Chrome liked the electrodes, precise in his cruelty. Squeak favored stress positions, laughing as men collapsed. Plier boots broke bones as if counting beads on a rosary. They called the prisoners animals. Makar joined the animals by answering with poems murmured into cupped hands, with chessboards traced in soot on the floor, with songs hummed so low only those pressed shoulder to shoulder could hear. Not every guard was a savage. Some played the role under the warden's eye, but once a guard dropped bandages into the yard, hands shaking, his stare wild with shame. Another time, a sack of potatoes accidentally rolled too close to the fence. Makar never knew whether these were accidents or silent rebellions. What he learned was simpler. People everywhere do what they must to survive. But in a world built on cruelty, survival can turn anyone into a monster. For Makar, language became revelation. His village near Narva had spoken Russian, but the authorities treated his neighbors no differently than the civilians of Aleppo or Gao. His brothers and sisters of the pit spoke words from around the world, from English, Polish, Estonian to Lithuanian. As a child, I used to think Russian was my heritage because I spoke Russian, he whispered once to Arvo, shame squeezing his chest. Arvo's face was swollen from a beating, but his eyes were steady as he put his arm around Makar's shoulders. It is your heritage. They don't get to define who you are. Remember, Joseph was sold by his own brothers. Everyone has birth families, but true family are the ones who pass you bread and bind your wounds. Russian, Latvian, or Finn, you are my family. When new prisoners came, Arvo pushed something into the guard's hand, then pushed Makar forward despite Makar resisting. The boy goes. He spoke it with authority. Makar stepped into the light, and his stomach clenched as he saw Arvo and his brothers and sisters left behind in the pit. Makar fiercely told himself, I am a witness. Madrid, Spain, 2033. 5 years later, Makar stepped off a flight in Madrid under a false Belarusian passport. As he approached a black SUV that idled with hazard lights, the Spanish sun beat on his bare head. Fighting through the smell of asphalt and ozone was the hint of wild thyme and fennel. Inside the SUV sat a big Yoruba man with the frame like a rugby center. Adewale Ajayi, who taught him how to hot rig a fiber optic spool in a forest outside of Vilnius, smiled broadly and clasped Makar's hand as he entered. Behind the wheel was a svelte Frenchman named Lucien Vey, who looked more like a fashionista than a field handler. "The Russian regime wants the prime minister dead on camera," Lucien said as he swerved past a protest. Students with cardboard signs chanted in front of a line of guardia in riot gear. Shields gleamed in the sun. A baton came down harder than it needed to. They're paying the guardia to crack heads, while paying protesters to march. While Spain tears itself apart, NATO grows weaker. It is the same hybrid war playbook they use around the world. The safe house in Lavapiés was as bare as a coffin. Plain white walls, a table covered in layered maps, and black cases that snapped open to reveal drones. Officially, it was an abandoned industrial site that smelled of dust and oil. Makar leaned over looking at the maps, while surreptitiously studying his people. Tomas and Pilar, Colombian twins he'd fought beside near Turku, watched him with hawk eyes. Andri's breath reeked, but he could wire a charge blindfolded. Oksana could outlift most men, and once carried 2 miles while Makar bled. Serhi stole food, fuel, radios, but in Tijuana, theft saved the team. Mart and Katrine wanted only one thing: revenge for the children they'd lost. Rasmus snored like a cave-in, but when the fight came, his hands were steady as a surgeon. They were ordinary once. Now they were part of the Green Company. He tapped the map of Madrid. "We all know how the hot phase ended," he said. He told them what they all already knew, because it mattered that the words be spoken aloud. Makar thought to himself, "We can't move on. We can't let go. We must remember." Makar continued speaking. Russia ran out of cash. Their front lines starved. Veterans marched on Moscow, and when the Kremlin was cornered, they fired one topol at Chicago. He saw their faces harden at the memory of when the world shifted. American air defense failed. In the last minute, the missile self-destructed above the magnificent mile. 10,000 dead outright, 50,000 died slowly from radiation sickness. And that generation of Americans? They turned inward and locked the doors. Despite the American homeland being assaulted, the isolationists chose the appeasement of Blue Judas, allowing the Russian regime to close the Suwalki Gap and invade the Baltics, disallowing the use of American armaments for defense. Rasmus shed a silent tear but stood stock still. The Americans left us to face the horrors alone. The Second Cold War started shortly after the guns stopped, but this time NATO stood alone. Putin never brought his veterans home. They were sent abroad, hidden behind the masks of private military companies. Makar saw the hardened bitterness reflected in each face. The Green Company does what governments will not. We stand in the gap between ordinary people trying to live their best life and the tyranny of the nuclear powers. America used to provide balance, but we live in the world we have, and not the one we wish we had. Serhi squinted his gray eyes and looked around the room. We fought Tiraspol as they trained the cartels in ambushes that left ICE agents shredded along the American border. Makar shuddered as a memory flashed into his mind. I can still remember the ICE agents' contempt of our drone warfare training, but mourned each agent's funeral, seeing their grieving spouses and children. They just refused to listen. Thomas, with a scar from his collarbone down to his right arm, nodded at the memory of those dark early days before security measures caught up to drones, then squeezed his sister tight as her right eye aggressively twitched. She developed a nervous tic that flared when the past was discussed. Pilar and I helped thwart a coup in Azerbaijan organized by Amu Darya Security. Andri stood proudly. We fought against Condor International's efforts to create breakaway regions in the Amazon. Makar smiled as he remembered how tribal folks were naturally talented at hunting the military contractors. Rasmus breathed heavily and whispered through his cut vocal cords. We demolished Kshatra Solutions in Nagaland, where they launched raids on the Myanmar rebels. Warmth filled the room as the team reminisced about the Green Company's victories against Russia's influence campaigns. Makar felt pride fill him, but he sobered, knowing death was like a tiger purring their names. NATO-E officially denies support, but unofficially they hire us to fight their shadow war. And now the war has arrived in Europe, starting with the Volga Group in Spain. Lucien stepped in. Officially, we are a Swiss private security group here to provide crowd control for the Prime Minister's upcoming speech in the Plaza de España. But the Prime Minister's guards are sidelining us. But they are not prepared for a fiber optic drone assassination. These are not the standard drones NATO-E counters for. These carried spools of hardened fiber, resistant to jamming, flying fast and dumb but lethal. The kind of drone that slipped past NATO-E doctrine entirely. The EIC contract gets us in the security perimeter, but we do not have Spanish support. After a moment of shocked silence at the brazenness of the operation, Rasmus asked softly, barely above a whisper, "Why risk a NATO-E response?" "Because the Prime Minister Ismael Cortázar Ruiz is loudly anti-Russian," Lucien said, speaking with authority. "He's been arming insurgent groups in the occupied areas through Spanish state-supported arms contracts, pushing for stiffer sanctions on Russia in Brussels, and calling Moscow out for the surge of violence driven by Russian-affiliated PMCs. The wave of al-Qaeda violence that followed the CIA-trained Mujahideen pales in comparison to the hundreds of thousands of decommissioned, well-trained drone operators, making €500,000 per kill mission." Heads nodded as they all benefited from the demand of the specialized drone skill that slipped through the gaps of most security systems. But he's also throwing migrants into camps and choking autonomy at home. Half the country hates him, and the other half depends on him. His death on live television fractures Spain and rattles NATO-E. Adewale's expression hardened. Volga Group's dream contract. Madrid, Spain, next day. As the team unpacked the crates in the safe house warehouse, Oksana asked, "What has the Carpathian dreamed up this time? And where is my lovely little man?" Makar laughed at the latest drama between the broad-shouldered Oksana and Takumi, their diminutive, brilliant engineer. Fiber-optic concussive drones dropped from a lighter-than-air platform. The room went very quiet because of the most recent operations disaster. Andriy muttered, "We tried that in Nagaland. The elevation helped, but fiber-optic drones still cut us apart." Pilar's voice snapped like a whip, the most anyone had heard from her in months. Elevation gave us first eyes, gave us faster kill chains. But it was still too slow to save her. Each word landed louder, raw with anger. Makar let the moment sit as everyone remembered vivacious Irina. He raised his palms. "This isn't the same." The Carpathian made the platform's brains smarter. The platform creates a baseline defense grid with radar, LiDAR, and acoustics based on data built up over time. Oksana and Andriy will raise it as soon as we can. The longer it sits, the smarter it gets. The rest, scatter mics far beyond the perimeter. The acoustic shield buys us seconds to know where the assassins are coming from. Adewale cracked his knuckles. "And we're on drone duty." Makar nodded. Drones split in pairs with one as munition and the other as detonator. Thermobaric overpressure means no shrapnel in the dense urban environment. Enough to swat a Russian fiber-optic assassin from above out of the sky. Adewale nodded. "A bigger boom." No one smiled. Too many prototypes had already ended in funerals. On the way to the Plaza de España, Lucien called Inspector Jefe Marta Aguilar to coordinate setting up the defensive perimeter. The Inspector Aguilar was fiercely critical and challenged Lucien why the intel on the third suspected assassination attempt was any better than the earlier false alarms. The team overheard the inspector incredulously ask, "You want me to sign off on an unregistered airship in Madrid airspace loaded with bombs?" Eventually, Lucien used enough EIC authority to get her to sign off, but she ended the call with a final warning that if flak came her way, that she will move heaven and hell to make Lucien pay. Pre-dawn light silvered the cobblestones of the plaza with hot stone radiating even at dawn. The faint kerosene smell drifted in from Barajas, and the smell of fresh baked bread mixed with trash pickup. Trucks backed in through service gates with stamped papers, cargo listed as telecommunications equipment. Reality was rougher. Inside were crates of polymer wings and racks of drones. The Prime Minister's guards bristled at the unusual equipment, and the team was not on the security clearance list. The head of site security argued with Adewale until Inspector Aguilar sent in confirmation. 40 minutes wasted. Meanwhile, the most critical piece of their hardware, the disguised winch truck, sat fully exposed on the curb of Calle de la Princesa. When the Green Company finally set up, they unfurled the lighter-than-air flying wing frame, like a giant sideways cigar with a flattened bottom. Its polymer superstructure was rough to the touch, like coarse denim, a weave engineered to catch light without reflecting it. Makar dragged his gloved hand across the fabric, feeling the slight rasp as if the material itself wanted to resist smoothness. One by one, the interior hydrogen balloons filled inside its ribbed compartments, swelling pale and taut. Between them, nitrogen hissed in, cushioning every cell in a sheath that would quench flame and slow rupture. Leaks were inevitable. A pinhole hissed along the trailing edge. Makar pressed his ear close, heard the faint whistle, and signaled for patch resin. Another seam tore under tension, and Serhi and Rasmus stitched it shut with polymer thread, hands tacky with adhesive. By 9, the structure was swollen into form. The gondola truss hung beneath, skeletal and waiting. The gondola carried concussive warheads that generated only blast pressure. They were built to knock drones from the air with shockwaves that struck from several angles, keeping collateral damage low in crowded streets. Radar and LiDAR pods mounted alongside gave the platform its vision. A tether unspooled from the truck as the balloon lifted quietly into the sky. When pedestrians asked about the lighter-than-air craft, the crew handed out flyers with Prime Minister Ismael Cortázar Ruiz's campaign slogans and login details for free public Wi-Fi. When the winch engaged, the wing lifted, jittering slightly as overpressure vents tested their flow. It climbed until its profile spread against the sky, a hazy outline, so diffuse it might have been mistaken for heat shimmer. After the siesta, the team gathered to prepare for the afternoon rally when a grainy clip landed in their secure channel, a bloodied blindfolded Lucien bound to a chair. A voice speaking Russian demanded, "Withdraw and walk away." Adewale folded the ruined cup into his palm and kept his face blank. Makar looked at each of them before he spoke, measured and uncompromising. "We cannot divide ourselves. Attempting both a rescue and a defense will doom them both. If we pursue Lucien, the Prime Minister dies. If we stay, Lucien suffers. But there is a chance that he survives." The table was silent. Mart said firmly, "He recruited us. He believed in us." Katrin, eyes on her husband, answered, "He'd tell us to finish the mission." Makar thought of Arvo in the pit, pushing him forward. He swallowed and said, "We hold." Adewale stood. "One thing I've learned is never leave a man behind. The team doesn't need 2 drone operators." Makar knew that being short a drone operator was cutting the margin razor thin. He also knew Adewale was leaving no matter what he decided, so he said, "The Uzbek is in town." Others offered names of people they trusted, and Makar thought maybe it was enough. The plaza was packed, and the Prime Minister's guards blanketed it with standard security. Buildings were cleared for snipers. Counter-snipers stood on the roofs along with people holding anti-drone jammers and electronic warfare packs, their gear gleaming under the fading light. Makar thought it was useless, and his stomach dropped at how little they understood. The world was not ready for a fiber-optic drone assassin, not ready for the first time a prime minister or a president turned into pink mist live on every screen. Above, the lighter-than-air platform drifted, its sensors stitched together a radar and LiDAR map of the surrounding blocks. its audio net sharpened by years of social media clips from the plaza. Rallies, concerts, tourist chatter, trained to sift the ordinary from the anomalous. The Volga group waited until twilight, when specialized mics well beyond the plaza perimeter caught the sudden crack of two cornet igniter charges. The mic's time of arrival math gave the AI bearings before radar even confirmed the launches. Seconds later, the rising whine of the missiles climbing toward the lighter-than-air platform reached the plaza, while two fiber-optic drones raced low for the Prime Minister. One came screaming down Calle de Martín de los Heros. The other suddenly arched high over the rooftops from Calle del Rio. The Green Company moved before anyone else even knew. Standard security protocols weren't built for this new war. They didn't even realize the threats were inbound. Tomas, Pilar, Andri, and Oksana set a perimeter. Serhii stepped in as the backup drone operator. Mart took overwatch with his rifle. Katrin screamed into the joint security channel to move the Prime Minister. Rasmus ran to the Prime Minister's guard liaison. But none of the threats were visible, so the Prime Minister's guards froze, losing critical seconds. The Cornets were launched far from outside the plaza, but they were faster, rapidly closing the distance to the platform hundreds of meters in the air. The defensive drones immediately and automatically launched, after detecting the ignition clicks and drone motors having approximately a 2-second lead. Makar watched as 8 pairs dropped from the gondola and broke wide in formation, trailing silvery fiber optic cables, 2 pairs for each target. The AI plotted crude but effective attack paths, but successful cornet interception is around 40%, so Makar immediately put the lighter-than-air platform into evasive motion. Each cornet would be boxed between 2 cheap drone sets. The lead drone sprayed a fuel-rich mist, and the trailing unit carried a detonator charge. It was ugly, off-the-shelf tech grafted into a missile shield, but it only had a chance of working because of the AI brain trained in advance on telemetry, with LIDAR guiding the final moments. The first intercept lit clean and worked exactly as designed. The mists bloomed into a cloud on each side, boxing in the cornet, and detonators flared the mists into a pressure wave that caused just enough damage to the fins for the cornet to fly off course. The second attempt failed. The first cloud touched off too early by a gust or laser jitter. The second set aborted in response. As missiles shrieked overhead, the plaza dissolved into panic. A few bystanders froze, phones raised to capture the strange beauty of the deadly duel. As the fiber-optic drones broke the plaza perimeter, the Prime Minister's guards uselessly fired their jammers into dead air, then panicked and snapped shots at the drones. Prime Minister Ruiz was dragged from the podium toward an armored SUV and raced for the one exit that looked clear. The vast flying wing jittered into evasive motion at a snail's pace, its broad frame groaning as control surfaces snapped and electric props strained. Makar dumped overpressured nitrogen through vents, a puff that jolted the ship sideways just enough. The incoming warhead's blast shoved the platform farther still, turning what should have been a direct strike into a grazing burst. Shrapnel ripped through the skin, puncturing a handful of hydrogen cells, but the gas bled off harmlessly. The airship sagged and creaked, but the massive wing held most of its buoyancy and stayed aloft just long enough to guide the last defensive drones towards the racing drone assassins. As skilled as the Volga Group drone operators were, their every movement was anticipated. The lighter-than-air platform's AI ran every step automatically, and with the elevation advantage, the Green Company struck first, every time. Makar's defensive drones spread above the fiber-optic assassin drones and knocked them down with overpressure concussive blasts. But Serhii, watching the broader angles, spotted the trap. "Makar, it's an ambush!" He pointed to the one exit left open, where a loitering drone could be hidden in the curb clutter like a roadside bomb, waiting for the SUV. "Just like what we did in Tijuana, herding sheep to the obvious exit," Serhii said gravely. Makar disengaged 2 aborted drones' parachutes and dropped them toward the 2 most likely ambush spots, hoping gravity would crush the hidden assassins before they struck the SUV. But he couldn't rely on hope. Makar said grimly, Mart, shatter the glass panels in the path of the SUV. Mart hesitated, knowing the risk, then laid flat, steadied his rifle, and exhaled. Glass sprayed in front of the Prime Minister's SUV, causing it to slow just enough for the kinetic bombardment to work. Secondary detonations confirmed both suspected sites had hidden drones. The team cheered until a sniper, misreading Mart's fire in the direction of the Prime Minister's vehicle, put a round through his skull. Miami, United States, 2038. Even 6 years later, Makar remembered the way Katrine's horror twisted into a rictus smile at the suddenness of Mart's loss. The moment never faded. He still felt the pain every time he wrote a name in the company's ledger. Fiercely, Makar relived the memory of opening the worn leather cover and writing, Mart Pold, saved Spain and Naito E. Over time he learned that while there are moments when lives must be risked, that most missions are worth failing if it means keeping his people alive. Katrin bore her grief differently. She spent the rest of her life tearing open Russia's breeding camps, their grotesque attempt to stave off demographic collapse. The ledger was closed, but its weight carried forward into every room he entered, even 12 years later in Miami. Makar steadied his heart, reminding himself of the debt he owed to the people he had led. The conference room overlooked Miami's Biscayne Bay. Sunlight flashed across the water and scattered through the glass walls. Inside, the air was cool and hummed with the steady whisper of conditioned air. Makar adjusted his tie, the gesture stiff, unnatural on him, then began. The screen lit with the schematic of the Green Company's latest generation lighter-than-air platform, its design evolving through 12 years of battle testing. The world saw what elevation combined with the speed of AI could achieve in Madrid, he told the semicircle of investors. Since then, we've expanded from persistent defense to search and rescue. Once a baseline is created within a region, our platforms detect the faintest signs of life, whether in a forest or a collapsed building. With each baseline added, our offerings have expanded to early warnings for avalanches, piracy, and forest fires. That growth is reflected in our numbers with 15% compounded returns and 40% profit margins. Kazuo Nakamura, a co-founder of Kazuna Capital, cut in. 40% margins aren't defense contractor economics. What exactly are you selling, Makar? Makar smiled broadly. The airships are the hardware, but the value is in the data. Millions of hours of audio, a data moat no competitor can replicate. That's why our services come in at a quality and cost that no one else can touch. Governments, shippers, insurers, they're finding we aren't optional anymore. We're becoming infrastructure. The door opened. A man entered without introduction, and everyone instinctively stood in a sign of respect. But Makar stared, his pulse loud in his ears. Shocked recognition broke across his face, sharp and unguarded. Arvo! He studied the images on the screen, but his eyes settled on Makar. His voice was calm, deliberate. No, my friend. My name is Mikhail Mirov. Chapter 4. Tuvalu Embassy, Singapore. Tuvalu Day, 2044. Each team member was disappointed in their own way. They gathered to choose a mask among the choices of absurd sequins and feathers against black tie formality. Pramanasari had the best number and chose a vaguely bird-like mask. She tilted her head toward Camille. Chicken. Camille Dubois frowned disapprovingly. It is a phoenix. Adewale selected a monkey and said to Rafal Radecki, Look, I'm you. The group roared in laughter with Rafal laughing the hardest as the rest of the team chose their masks. As the team wrapped up dressing, Lucien maintained surveillance on the door through which the Tuvaluan delegation would pass through on the way to their limousines. Daniel Carter cursed and said, Boss, we have a problem. The kitty cage is in your suit. Lucien tamped down his first gut reaction that this was a betrayal. Let's swap roles. We anticipated our plans would require adjustments. The delegation is behind schedule. Camille covered surveillance as Lucien slipped into his gear and Daniel showed him what to do. As the delay became prolonged, Daniel was the first to speak to keep the team sharp. "I've always wanted a dog but never stayed in one place long enough. Now I just imagine each team member as..." Daniel's eyes lingered on Camille. "Dobermans." She quirked a smile and threw a pillow at him. Adewale Ajayi, eager to share his news, said, "Just before mission dark, my wife texted that we were selected to be on the first wave of colonists to Venus." Lucien, in shock, blurted, "Going back to your roots as a Yoruba farmer?" Adewale grimaced and backhanded Lucien on the chest, with just enough force to cause him to exhale. "My family have been chocolatiers for 3 generations, and each of my daughters has been learning the family trade. We are bringing that to the new world." His face beamed with pride. Lucien gave him a hug and said, "I'm so happy for you and the girls." After the team all shared their congratulations, everyone sat quietly in expectation for the delegation. Camille waited until the doors began to open to say, "Went is my father." Tuvalu Day was spelled out in a giant spectacle. A dense swarm of tiny drones formed pinpricks of light that turned the night sky into Tuvalu rising from the ocean as Helena Strasser opened Tuvalu Day. 10 years ago, the Mirov family invested and designed permanence. The caissons, 40 feet tall, reclaimed Tuvalu from the sea, caisson by caisson, for 5 years to form the foundation of a new Tuvalu. The drones transformed to show the power of Mirov enterprises to create land from the sea, and Helena Strasser stood with a giant diamond held above her head. Each segment was cast in chloride-resistant geopolymer concrete, reinforced not with steel, but with basalt fiber tendons. The platform was designed to absorb the powerful Pacific swells. The platform's edge was covered in sand to form a beach that reminded people of the Tuvalu of their memories. Applause rippled as the drones echoed Helena's words. Behind her sat Julia van der Velde, the only other publicly known board member outside of the Mirovs, accompanied by a poised Asian woman Lucien had never seen before. Lucien allowed himself half a moment to reminisce of his time with Julia before catching a Green Company operative staring at him. Lucien thought, "If they are here, then their drones will be as well." In the 3rd year after commissioning, a Tuvaluan couple waded deep from the platform's edge towards the reef, seeded to form a wave break, and threw into the ocean a stone of green quartz from a mountain in Japan, the place where their son had died, while dreaming of their future home. They remembered their son, but they also honored their people's recent struggle and the stories of their ancestors. And so, we too remember. Helena dropped a yellow diamond into a water column. Silence held, then celebration erupted. The madness of Tuvalu Day had begun. The Capella Singapore glimmered from the shoreline like a jewel too bright for its setting. It was a spectacle handcrafted for Tuvalu Day, where sovereignty itself was staged for global broadcast. From a surveillance blind spot near a marble pillar, Lucien adjusted his snake mask, the sequined edge chafing his cheek, an irritation he couldn't shake. Lucien wondered, was Daniel's swap a setup? With his one good eye, he tracked a woman in a turtle mask, topped with a crown, the cat code named Arthur tucked in her arms as part of the costume. A sudden shriek cut the air. The crowd gasped as an orange streak shot across the marble. Glass shattered. Guests stumbled aside in panic. But Lucien wasn't surprised. Vellum had trained Arthur to follow an irresistible mix of catnip and vanilla. The cat purred as it brushed against his leg. Lucien crouched, slipped the cat into the concealed cage, and used a passing guest to merge seamlessly out of the blind spot into the glittering crowd. Having the cat in place, Lucien paused for a moment to spot the Green Company's lighter-than-air platform. It had active camouflage, but Lucien knew how to spot the telltale edge distortion. When he spotted the lighter-than-air platform, there were too many red flags, so he waited until the top of the hour. He scratched his nose and nudged his mask left as a signal to Adewale's drone that the exfiltration is off. He waited for Rafal to signal confirmation, but when his mask did not vibrate the confirmation signal, he keenly felt the familiar feeling of betrayal. He grimly told himself, "They are coming." Lucian closed the distance with the crowned turtle and brushed against vellum, a subtle warning. He whispered, "Suwalki," their code to swim for the failsafe. Vellum nodded, and they split apart. Lucian fixed the escape route in his mind and drew slow, deliberate breaths. Then he heard a drone release a canister. He pressed a cloth to his mouth and nose and held his breath. Makar can be so uncreative, he thought, relieved it wasn't a nerve agent. The first plume hit. His eyes burned and sealed shut, tears spilling as fire filled his throat. People dropped, choking around him. Using a familiar song, Lucien bent low and moved by count and sound, every stride measured toward the Singapore Strait. Struggling to hold his breath, he told himself, almost there. He could hear the faint slap of water against wood and followed it, one hand extended until his palm struck the edge of the pier. That contact told him his position. Keeping low, he turned along the grain of the boards and ran by feel, one hand brushing the edge to stay oriented. By the fourth stanza of his rhythm song, he knew he was close to the deep end. A bullet struck his back shoulder but glanced off his thin body armor. More canisters burst behind him, thickening the air with pepper and sedatives. Half blind and gasping, Lucien reached the pier's end and leapt as bullets tore the surface. Ever since Madrid, Lucien had planned for layers of betrayal. His failsafe waited offshore. A chartered Rohingya crewed fishing vessel based out of Satun waited in the strait. He had recruited and trained Jasmine Eng as Vellum when she was still a first-year trainee. After whispering the code word to Jasmine, Lucian wasn't surprised that she survived. What did surprise him was her hand pulling him into the boat and her dry smile. "You've gotten old." He let himself smile back, rare and fleeting, before embracing her. Jasmine's face hardened. "Who betrayed us?" Lucien, eyes fixed on the islet, quietly but firmly said, "An hour gone." "The cabana will confirm if we have been betrayed." They watched as security dragged Freya, wearing Jasmine's turtle mask, out of the cabana confused and disheveled. As Freya struggled to free herself, a guard struck her hard in the abdomen. Jasmine's jaw clenched, fury in her eyes, but she remained silent. Lucien considered whether her cover had run too deep. Emotion was a liability. All staff stood at attention as the Asian woman Lucien had marked earlier strode forward, her fury cutting through the gala. She tore into the guard who froze under her authority, then steadied Freya with practiced composure. "That's Chi Wei, Mikhail's proxy, and her father was the one who declared Taiwan independent. They knew about Valence 9, so their EIC mole is well placed." As Jasmine exhaled deeply, Lucian considered who the mole could be. Jasmine scanned the crowd. "Any signs of my rescue team?" Lucian shook his head. "No signs, but we will find the traitor." He lowered his voice and told Rahman, the Rohingya skipper, "Take us north. Bantam Malangtai, Satun." Lucian sensed drones observing the boat, but he needed definitive proof of who betrayed him. By dawn, they were miles beyond Singapore's territorial line, the city's glow shrinking behind them as the fishing boat's engine droned north. Several days later, the morning mist hung low over a canal, softening the outlines of fishing boats moored along the wooden piers. Their hulls creaked against the tide, a slow rhythm in the silence. The air was heavy with the brackish scent of the mangroves. Salt mingled with the damp sweetness of decaying leaves. A faint tannic sharpness carried up from the roots clawing into the mud. Lucien and Jasmine sat on opposite ends of the boat, warily listening for the telltale sign of a drone. "Who was it?" Jasmine asked, scanning the dark. Lucien grimaced. "It had to be Camille, Daniel, or Adewale. We were under comms blackout, and only those three had the ability to tip off Maroff without a trace." As the boat drifted closer, the pier emerged from the haze plank by plank, lantern posts standing like sentinels in the pale light. The stillness was so complete that even the ripples seemed hushed, the morning unfolding as though the world itself had just woken. Out of the mangrove thickets, a brilliant turquoise and white kingfisher landed and looked at Jasmine, then cawed. Kick, kick, kick. Jasmine leaned against the gunwale of the fishing boat, scratching Minu's ears. Doesn't Kalina make more sense? Cat and spy and all that? Lucian chuckled. That's what you focus on? Not who betrayed the world? Jasmine stood up and soberly said, The list of people involved touches everyone you and I know, but people just think Mikhail is seeking justice or retribution. But his vision is bigger. What I've gathered is a list of targets and how many delivery systems there are. Lucian listened patiently. Schematics? Jasmine turned and gripped the gunwale so hard that Lucian could hear it creak. Jasmine steadied herself and said, No, but I know how the order will be transmitted. It will be from Arnhem Space Center. Lucian waited for Jasmine to continue, then eventually said, From the Arafura Arcology. Jasmine stared at the kingfisher, then grimly nodded. Mirov Enterprises' failed satellite internet startup that triggered the Kessler Cascade was just an excuse. As they donated billions to build a post-Kessler space infrastructure, they masked the kinetic bombardment delivery infrastructure within the error margin, and they are now ready to launch. Jasmine laid out the full plan to wipe out the world's strategic nuclear infrastructure in 3 waves, Lucian whispered as he processed the pattern. Taiwan, dollar devaluation, Kessler Cascade. Each was an engineered collapse that culminates in a final kinetic bombardment. Lucien's hardened self-control slipped as his face blanched. After absorbing the magnitude, Lucien laid out the plan. We will be taking a long, circuitous route ultimately to Dhaka. If Mirov suspected our current location, we would have been greeted with a drone-dropped welcoming package. So we will drive up through Thailand, cross over to Laos, sneak through Yunnan, then cut through northern Myanmar into Nagaland, and follow the Brahmaputra River into Dhaka. Jasmine, doubt in her eyes, asked, I get the smuggler's route to your old haunt to Dhaka, your old station, but we have 3 problems. You are persona non grata in China after the botched NSB joint operation. All paths cross through Akup Zeliang, who still hates you. And most importantly, where are we going to find food for Minu? Lucian smiled warily as the unusually warm orange tabby purred and rubbed against his calf. For the next 2 weeks, they were anyone they needed to be to mask their passage. One day, Australian beef exporters, Jasmine's every 3rd word a curse. The next day, Canadian missionaries handing out Bibles. Their transit papers showed a clean trail, entry at Mohan, a stop at Hornbill Valley, and onward to Myanmar. In reality, they walked across the Chinese border from Laos and straight into the first police station. Jasmine complained in both Cantonese and Mandarin of being robbed, loud enough for everyone to hear, invoking the names of mid-tier party members with just enough weight to unsettle, then sliding a discreet gift across the desk. Within an hour, the police chief handed them temporary travel documents, eager to be rid of troublesome foreigners. Lucien used bandages to cover his distinctive scars, but the gauze itched, rough against the skin above his cheekbone. And sunglasses hid the ruined eye. On a crowded Yunnan bus, it was the best cover he could manage. An injured foreigner instead of a recognizable man. Jasmine languished in the trapped heat of the bus interior with eyes half closed. She was uniquely able to rest, but also remain vigilant for extended periods of time. I was 7 when you rescued me from Liepaja. My parents had just died by a Russian bomb. One moment my family was exploring the beach, and the next I was an orphan war refugee. Out of all the people on that bloody beach, I've always wondered, why did you scoop me up? Lucian simply said, You would have died. The rest was cut off as the driver hit a rut hard enough to throw the chickens under the seats into a panic. Lucian's head snapped back against the window. The sunglasses lifted, and his bandages shifted to expose his skin for an instant. Lucian wondered to himself, was that intentional? He saw in the rearview mirror The driver's eyes widened a fraction, then narrowed. Lucien pressed the gauze back into place with one gloved hand, his posture unchanged, and did not look up again. He knew the man would make a call as soon as the bus stopped. Beside him, Jasmine adjusted her shawl and complained in Mandarin to the old woman across the aisle. Her hand, hidden beneath the fold of fabric, tapped once against her knee. A practiced signal asking whether to kill. Lucien's hand closed over hers, stilling it, and discreetly shook his head. Her jaw tightened, eyes forward. She returned to her chatter, voice steady as if nothing had passed between them. With one moment of exposure, the danger was already moving faster than they could. The bus left them near a trail that wound down toward the border. At night, the jungle was alive with the scrape of cicadas and the chatter of monkeys in the canopy. They followed a shallow creek, water brushing their boots as the current drew them toward Myanmar. Mist clung low, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and leaves. They slipped into practiced routines of drone dodging in the jungle. Jasmine whispered softly, "Is it the young emperor?" Lucien grunted in affirmation. He has reincarnated several times over the past 3 decades, but his power is now swiftly on the rise as people of Yunnan cross the border to avoid the crushing tax burden to support the extravagance of Beijing retirees. Adewale helped train his drone forces, and years later, Daniel warned him of a Beijing assassination. A hornbill's cry echoed, harsh and mournful. Jasmine glanced up, one hand already on the leather strap of her slingshot braced to her arm as they both froze under cover. The jungle pressed close, branches like skeletal fingers overhead. Then they heard it, the faint whirring hum, too steady to be insect wings. A quadcopter drone moved slowly above the canopy, its IR camera searching. Jasmine slid a steel ball into the pouch, pulled back smoothly without a sound. The drone above hovered at the end of its sweep, holding position just long enough for its camera gimbal to reset. She and Lucien had seen the pattern before, a brief hesitation before it shifted to the next arc. She waited for the stillness, then loosed. For a breath the machine shuddered in place, then toppled into the canopy. The explosion tore through the night. Lucien met Jasmine's eyes. That drone had not been searching. It had been hunting to kill. The Irrawaddy spread wide under the moon, a shifting mirror of silver-black water. A blindfolded Jasmine and Lucien stumbled from a boat while being pushed and shoved to the bank. They waited on their knees with their hands bound as Akup Zeliang approached, wearing a shawl draped in red and black and a rifle across his shoulder. When the men removed their blindfolds, Jasmine said, "Nice to see you, Commander Akup. We haven't seen you since Kohima." The broadly muscular man, with an unusually bushy beard, carefully considered his words. "When you betrayed us?" His fighters ringed him, and behind them the elders of the village stood in silence, beads clinking faintly in the night breeze. Lucien froze. Once, he and Akup had stood side by side when an extremist party manipulated Delhi's Hindi First decrees to strip Nagas of citizenship, emboldened by the global indifference to the plight of the Rohingya. He remembered the raids, the papers torn, and the families dragged from their burning homes. He also remembered the order from Brussels that the European Union would not oppose Delhi. Trade mattered more than the border tribes. Jasmine and Lucien were pulled out days before the killings. It was a massacre that didn't even reach the back pages of the New York Times. "You swore," Akup said, his voice low, resonant in the stillness. "You swore when they called us migrants on our own land, that you would stand with us. Praise Jesus that the Kachin Free State adheres to the Charter and opened their borders to us." Lucien's lips parted, but no words came as pain blossomed at the acrid memory. After the men unbound them, Jasmine stood, then stepped close to Akup, her eyes hard as a dangerous tension filled the crowd. "Don't put every grave on us. You saw us ignoring Brussels. We prepaid for 3 years of Green Company's services. We stretched every resource, and Lucien was made a pariah, Akup's jaw tightened in stubbornness. The Green Company stayed, but you left. Jasmine, understanding the beats of the reconciliation ritual, took a gamble and lashed out, striking him across the cheek. The crack echoed across the water. The crowd murmured, uncertain if they were witnessing justice or sacrilege. After forcing Akup to decide whether to kill them or forgive them, Jasmine took slow, deliberate breaths. She knew there was no way back, but Akup did not flinch. Slowly and deliberately, he struck her, not holding back, bloodying her lip. The Nagas stiffened as Jasmine and Akup stared at each other for a long, taut heartbeat. Then Jasmine stepped closer, and Akup's hands rose, hesitated, then drew her into a fierce embrace. With the reconciliation ritual completed, anger, grief, and recognition tangled in the silence. Afterwards, an elder stepped forward holding a Bible, its cover worn with age, to formalize the reconciliation. He placed it between them. Jasmine and Akup set their hands upon it, and after a moment of silence, Lucien added his own. The elder said, "This is not for the ashes of the past, but for the road ahead. From this night, we are reconciled." Jasmine, Lucien, and Akup affirmed. Then Akup stepped back, his face returning to stone. "There is one truth left. Why are Mirov hunters chasing you?" Jasmine spoke carefully. "Because we carry truths they fear." Akup's gaze narrowed. "Their leader once pulled me from death, and I owe him my life. For that reason, hear me, I will not raise my rifle against him, but I will also not lie to shield you. What comes, comes." He leaned closer, his voice harshly firm. "Do not mistake this oath for trust. Words are ash, actions are as firm as the hills. Tonight, we leave to guide you into India and set you on the Brahmaputra. But that is my final act. We are even." Lucien nodded in assent, knowing with certainty who the betrayer was that pursued them. Lucien grimly thought to himself, "I know who saved his life." Akup slung his rifle, his shadow stretching long in the moonlight. "You will have 2 days' lead. After that, if the hunters close, your survival is in your own hands." Above them, the stars glittered cold and sharp. The stink of old durian clung to their skin, layered with sweat, old fish, and the sour bite of stale alcohol. An old Lucian trick. He swore a beggar's odor was the only disguise that never failed. No uniform, no forged papers, no story to remember. Just stench. Enough to erase them from sight as people averted their gaze. The city's pulse pressed in around them. Dhaka's streets steamed with bodies and exhaust, the rickshaw bells chiming above the drone of prayer loudspeakers. Jasmine kept her head bowed, her eyes flicking only when she had to. They moved like unremarkable ghosts swallowed by the city. The shanty town was worse. Corrugated tin roofs leaned against one another like broken teeth, alleys no wider than an arm's span dripping with laundry water. At its center lay a single concrete blockhouse, unpainted and plain. Lucian had built it years ago, off books when he was station chief. Hidden inside was a satellite phone with a direct line to Went. Waiting for a crowd to blend in with, he took Jasmine past the blockhouse door to a sagging hovel next door. Inside, hidden behind a rusted panel, was his safeguard, a pinhole lens drilled through to the safe house and sighted on a strip of thin, plastered wood. Lucian quietly eased the panel free and leaned in. His jaw tightened when he saw Adewale sitting in the dim light with a rifle aimed at the door, waiting. Lucian exhaled through his nose with his expression hardening. He turned to Jasmine and mimed an opening gesture as he drew a hidden handgun. She understood, and her lips tightened in resolve. When another crowd passed the blockhouse door, she rattled it hard, then leapt aside. The shot came instantly. A crack split the air, and splinters burst from the wood. Lucien fired through the weakened patch without hesitation. The gunfire left the air ringing. Jasmine pushed through the shattered doorway, sweeping fast. Adewale was slumped, blood seeping through his shirt. She kicked the rifle away as Lucian stepped inside. Adewale managed a strained, knowing smile when he saw Lucian. "Lucien," he rasped. "Remember, this is how I found you in Madrid, bleeding out on the floor." Lucien looked at the man who had once saved him from a cruel fate, but now only saw a stranger. "You knew from the start." Lucian nodded. "It is what I would do. Send someone my target completely trusts. But why, Adewale?" Adewale coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Mirov brings justice. To Russia most of all, but to all the butchers who killed under the shield of nuclear terror." He gasped for breath. "Why would you stand against that?" Lucian's voice was quiet, almost weary. "Because of the innocent lives that vanish with the guilty. Children, farmers, women just trying to feed their families. That isn't justice. That's a drone strike on a wedding to kill a single terrorist." Adewale's chuckle rattled in his chest. "Innocent?" His gaze fixed on Lucian. "After everything we've seen, how can you still believe in innocence? We've watched villages burn, heard lies justify the slaughter. We can only go from bad to a little better. And Mirov's way is a little better." Lucien didn't flinch. People everywhere are doing the best they can with the hand they've been dealt. Even the Russians. For a moment, silence pressed in. Lucian already knew the answer, but asked anyway. "If I joined, what happens to Jasmine?" Adewale's eyes shifted to her. She stood in the doorway, shoulders squared, the weight of the moment crushing her. The silence stretched, thick and dangerous. His eyes softened, just for a flicker. "Lucien, make sure my family makes it to Venus. My girls, they deserve that much." Lucien considered him, long and grave. Then he nodded once. Adewale's smile faltered into something raw. "The pain is too much. End it." For a long second, Lucian's finger rested still on the trigger. Then he squeezed. Adewale's smile slackened as if he were asleep. Lucian stood in the quiet aftermath, Jasmine's breath trembling in the doorway. The city roared outside, indifferent, as Lucian screamed.
Chapter 5. Amman, Jordan, 2045. A memory floated above Amman. Long ago, the plateau was crowned with oaks and pistachios, green and abundant, and the people lived in peace. When disaster struck faraway lands, people fled to the western sea, and those pressed from the coast climbed to these hills where they were welcomed. Soon people fled from every direction, and all found welcome. But then the rain turned away, and terraces cracked. The people who once filled the valleys with music, then fought the earth for food, and forgot to dream. War followed with unending strife. Walls rose first from stone, then paper, and the shadows of the walls withered hope. But from the city rose a woman with a vision of a world without walls, without borders, where knowledge was stronger than might. And the people of Amman dreamed again. From her balcony in Jabal al-Wabde, Lina Barakat smelled pine and olives in the morning breeze as the limestone hills turned honey in the dawn light. Abdali's towers shimmered in the early haze, bright flashes across the pale desert sky. From the minarets, the Fajr Adhan rose, carrying through the hills just as in the Prophet's time. Just as in Petra, people from all over the world mixed. Cafes hummed with the sound of Lebanese roasting coffee beside Estonian bakers. Syrian tailors sold fabric with Colombian apprentices learning stitches. Billboards shifted through a dozen languages with the charter tenets of knowledge for everyone, freedom of movement and exile over execution. Lina and Chiwei wrote the charter in marker on the back of scrap paper and taped it to the peeling wall of a rented lab above a bakery called Rokalil, owned by a very irate Estonian. Lina still winced at the memory of so many stern looks. Chiwei frequently read the charter aloud to keep them honest, and it spread like wildfire across walls and screens. Somaliland and the Kachin Free State have made it official state policy. A warning buzzed on her phone, which said, "Chiwei is in Amman." What were the chances that the very day Lina could finally think of her old co-founder without bile rising, Chiwei would return? Her hand stiffened around the railing at the memory of the choice that had divided them. The choice of Mirov, the future they had sworn never to take, Hospitality came before argument. Later that evening, her mother filled the courtyard with moussakhan steaming under saffron, tabbouleh bright with parsley, and hummus drenched in olive oil. But her mother's favorite was cannella rolled with cardamom, which she insisted everyone try at least once. "This cinnamon roll is worthy of a caliph's table," she exclaimed, eyes bright as if she were serving it in the Citadel Palace. Lena smiled at her mother's devotion to Estonian baked goods and the quiet comfort it brought. Cousins arrived with laughter, uncles with worry, aunts with questions. Then Chi-Wei stepped through the gate, moving with the same calm grace Lena remembered. For a moment, Lena forgot to breathe. The sight of her unearthed something she had buried too long, as she thought to herself. "You have no right to walk in as if nothing happened." A quieter thought followed, as soft as a whisper, she thought to herself. "And yet I am glad you did." The two feelings collided, leaving her steady only on the surface. She walked forward and opened her arms, her voice calm. "Welcome." As they embraced, Chi-Wei leaned close and whispered, "It is good to see you." Lena held her gaze and offered the kind of smile that belonged to a good host, not an old friend. "It has been too long." To Lena's family, Chi-Wei was a long-lost friend returned. They knew the story of the acrimonious break, but they understood Chi-Wei's choice as much as they worried about Lena's idealism. They also knew they were better together. Her father was just about to begin his familiar lecture about how the Arabic spoken in Jordan was the purest, the very tongue of the prophet, when the family hurried to set the table. Dishes clinked, hands passed bread and olives, the room filling with the warmth of routine. Once plates were full, the talk turned, as it always did, to Palestine. "The tunnel is freedom," said Tariq, her youngest cousin, still carrying the uneven stubble of youth. He spoke quickly, eager for her approval. "Yesterday I went from Beit Hanun to Yatta in 20 minutes. Where else can that happen? The charter's right. Borders are no longer necessary." Lena set down her spoon, her eyes steady on him. "No, Tariq, borders must be strong. If they shift, every crazy old man with a 400-year-old map thinks he has the right to redraw the world. The charter isn't about erasing borders. It is about making every life sovereign, each person their own world. The tunnel doesn't erase borders. It makes Palestine whole." "It works so long as the peacekeepers stay," an uncle muttered. Mariam, her aunt only a few years older, responded fiercely. "This time is different. Europe needs the gas fields near Gaza. The tunnel wasn't built for charity." The 1,000-year-old argument of Europeans meddling in the Middle East reared its head, voices rising and clashing as they always had. Then Chi-Wei leaned in close to Lena and whispered, as though their 20-year estrangement had never happened, "We need to talk about something urgent." Later that night, Lena retired to the quiet of her tower. "God forbid ya ukti, never." Lena's voice carried across glass and marble, sharp enough to cut through the open expanse of the penthouse. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered with a skyline that spoke of wealth Amin had never known when she was a girl. The penthouse was perched above it all in a tower Lena fully owned, cooled by hidden ducts and framed with olive wood panels. Her 5-year-old youngest child, Laith, hummed to himself as he swung a foam sword. Laith looked up at his mother's outburst, then quietly returned swinging his sword, but he listened without looking up. Chi-Wei did not flinch. She never did. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," Lena snapped. "You want me to bless disequity written into flesh. Life extension for the wealthy. That isn't medicine. It's ikta with sequencers and cryochambers. You want to bring back feudalism?" 20 years ago, Lena would have raged, but now she used the same calm, deliberate tone used to build the charter movement. It was never about Mirov's money. We needed investors, yes, but the fight was always about control. Chemistry was just the first step. We built the platform to drive down the cost of drug discovery, so medicine would belong to everyone. "And then you sold it," Lena said, fury rising. "You betrayed the charter when you handed Mirov the controlling interest. You didn't just sell shares, you sold the vision. Your vision." "I did what I had to," Chi-Wei said firmly. "And now you come here, into my home, and ask for my help?" Lena's laugh was incredulous. "Help you give Mikhail Mirov another 30 years to accumulate power? Don't insult me. You think this is about one person? It's never about one person. If the wealthy never die, if they never hand their control to another generation, You lock disequity into the marrow of the world. Worse than the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank forcing nations to borrow in dollars or euros. At least debt ends when it's paid. Immortality never ends. From the corner, Lath swung his foam sword at the umbrella stand, and he squealed with laughter as it fell with a clatter, but also listened to every word of their conversation. Chi-Wei's gaze dropped, and as she spoke, her voice trembled. This isn't about the wealthy. It is about how extending just his life could save billions. Lena froze. In all the years she had known Chi-Wei, through brilliance, arrogance, and betrayal, Lena had never once heard Chi-Wei tell an outright lie. Disingenuous, yes. Calculating, always. But never a lie. She knew then for certain that Chi-Wei was desperate for her help to avoid a catastrophe. Her mind steadied, testing the claim against what she already feared. This has to do with Mina Star, doesn't it? Chi-Wei said nothing. The silence was louder than denial. Lena sat rigid, anger cooling into cold precision, seeing an opportunity in Chi-Wei's fear. Finally, she said, I will help, but we will need more people. The next day, Jonas Kincaid, wearing a tweed blazer, was the first to join the call. Years in the sun had etched lines across his face and left gray at the edges of dark, unkempt hair. His eyes were the color of steel and carried the weight of calculation. Good to see you, Lena. Even after all these years, his smile still made Lena's stomach flutter. Vikram Raghavan was next. Dark hair, kept short, framed a face marked more by discipline than age. His eyes were steady, black in most light, and unreadable when he chose them to be. A thin silver cross rested at his collar, worn smooth with time. He must be annoyed not to be first, Lena thought. Vikram spoke with a firm but hurried tone that tended to blur his words. What was Chi-Wei doing in Aman? Lena shook her head. We have to hear about what happened on Tuvalu Day. As Lena finished, the last caller joined. Her face was round, the cheeks full but drawn by discipline into stillness. Her skin was pale brown, marked by faint lines that deepened when she frowned, which was often. Dark eyes sat steady behind rimless glasses, the gaze cool and assessing. Her mouth was firm, pressed into a line that gave nothing away. Pramanasari's cropped black hair was streaked with gray, but disguised with a youthful crimson and orange. Lena asked, Pramana, what happened in Singapore? Pramana nodded. Lena, thank you for the rescue operation. My cover at EIC has not been compromised, but it was a near thing. After the comms for the Vellum exfiltration went dead, I eventually returned to the safe house to find Rafal strangled with no sign of Adewale or the others. I fled to the cargo container until it was eventually unloaded in Osaka. Lena felt deeply disturbed at both the events of Tuvalu Day and her reliance on the extremist factions of the charter movement. Lena thought to herself, what do we really know about her? Is Pramana Sari even her real name? Sometimes she is known as Sari Pramana. Lena sighed to herself, and she told herself she cannot be picky with her allies. Jonas leaned toward Pramana as if the virtual walls could be crossed, but only said, Lucien Vey was picked up in Dhaka with the Vellum intel and is currently under EIC interrogation. Jasmine Ung has become a ghost again. The intel confirms that Mikhail and his abhorrent son have a constellation of stealth satellites hidden around 0.4 astronomical units. Vikram cut in, but which faction has control? The balance faction that wants to wipe out all nukes, the dominance faction that wants to replace the nukes with kinetic bombardment that only they control, or the status quo faction that wants to brick all the kinetic rods. But going to the point of this meeting, what does Chi-Wei want? Lena considered her dearest friend who came to her in a moment of desperate vulnerability. Lena thought to herself, this is greater than us. Chi-Wei wants to make Mikhail Mirov immortal. A week later, Chi-Wei Lin was the headline guest for the monthly charter forum. Leading up to the forum was intentionally leaked news that Mirov Enterprises intended to make a major announcement at the forum. Lena spotted each of her collaborators one by one. Jonas's unmistakable tweed jacket, Vikram's silver cross glinting at his collar, and Pramana's crimson-orange streak. They'd all agreed on the call to meet here, so each could evaluate Chi-Wei directly. It was not a light decision to risk one's life. The auditorium smelled of cedar and strong coffee. Translators whispered in glass booths above the crowd. Lena Barakat sat at the moderator's table, her indigo jacket plain, but her cuffs edged in gold thread. Across from her sat Chiwei, hair pinned back, jade at her throat. The room stilled as she folded her hands. A man in glasses wearing a tweed blazer rose from the audience. His beard was flecked with gray, his English accented with Swiss, low and measured. Director Lin, the KFE coin, promises knowledge for everyone. Mirov Enterprises seeks profit and control. Are they not antithetical? They are complementary, Chiwei said firmly. Since the KFE white paper was published, it achieved what Western aid abjectly failed to do: organic economic growth in the developing world. Without debt traps, villages anywhere in the world bootstrap their economies. And that is when Mirov enters. One without the other starves. Together, we accelerate. A woman stood next. Her black denim was patched, a crimson and orange streak cutting through her cropped hair. Her voice rang sharp. Borders are cages. I agree with the charter to tear them all down. Let populations move and watch the old order collapse. Chiwei inclined her head. You are right about the collapse. Weak states that trap people are pressure cookers. When movement is free, that leverage breaks. But where you see an ending, I see a beginning. True, there is short-term disruption, but then it creates stability as people choose their community. That stability creates opportunity. A third stood, straight-backed in a tailored suit with a silver cross on his collar, his words clipped. If Mirov cares so much about stability, doesn't the charter cut against it? Especially exile over execution. China's system is proof that stability in both politics and economics is achievable. Exile just sends trouble across a border. Chiwei's gaze did not waver. I agree that not every stable community must be democratic. The people of some states emphasize stability and prosperity. However, people who reject the arrangement can leave. Regimes that maintain strong social controls breed martyrs, fill prisons, and ultimately destabilize their neighbors. An alternative that works just as well is exile without the regional instability. But people need a safe destination, which is why the board has approved that all Mirov arcologies will join the charter. Venus and Mercury will join as well. In the past 20 years, the charter has proven it works to reduce violence. And to gain the stars, we need a system that works. Lena leaned forward, holding a card. The charter began on scrap paper as your vision, but you've never signed. Will you now? After a momentary hesitation, Chiwei signed with a flourish as the audience cheered and cameras flashed. After the forum, the train to Beit Hanun glided quietly, its motion more felt than heard. Chiwei and Lena had the carriage to themselves. After Mirov's security finished their screening, the guards withdrew without a word. To most observers, the tunnel looked ordinary, but Lena saw the pattern behind the walls, the sensors, and redundancy and constant watchfulness. And the old indignation rose again. Mirov Enterprises had funded the tunnel, yet she still tasted the bitterness of the compromise that made it possible. Alexander had forced her hand and told her to sign or let the project die. At the center of the design were peacekeepers, layers of surveillance, and over-engineered ventilation shafts built on the belief that Palestinians were violent by nature. Chiwei sat across from her with hands folded, her eyes steady, waiting for Lena to look away. I am glad you signed your own charter, Lena said. Chiwei shook her head. Ideas don't matter. You made it real, and the chemistry platform was never the goal. It was intended to fund the coin, which in turn funded the safe space for refugees. Lena thumped the table and stood up. But we were supposed to do it together, Lena hissed the words, venting 20 years of frustration. We did do it together. Your share of the platform sale was substantial, Chiwei continued. But you still needed more to launch KFE. Did you ever wonder who Arcadia really was? The name hung in the air. Lena turned away silently to observe the peacekeeper observatories. She let the moment stretch. I knew, but it has been a lonely journey. Her thoughts turned toward other work Chiwei had done, less visible, yet more unsettling. For every prestige charter project Chiwei steered Mirov's resources towards, there were 3 projects that entrenched disequity. First, it was flawless genetically matched blood for the wealthy and mass-produced, but prone to rejection synthetic blood for everyone else. Now it is life extension for the wealthy and serfdom for everyone else forever. Once made, the genie cannot be put back in the bottle, but she was sure Chiwei sincerely needed this, because she was just too desperate. Lena asked herself, but how exactly will the billions be saved? After finally making a decision, Lena said, "I will prioritize life extension at the next management meeting." Her voice was even, but dread filled her heart. The charter's management meeting was completely silent. No voices, no faces, only text spilling across the screen and dissolving as quickly as it appeared. While anyone could follow charter principles, joining the economic ecosystem at a state level required authorization, and voting power was measured in stake alone. Lena held just under half, the founder's weight, yet she rarely cast it outright. Instead, she portioned out influence through temporary proxies. Lena thought to herself, KFE was nearly mature. Soon she could divest and finally step away. She exhaled, the burden pressing against her ribs. The first agenda item was an Osaka consortium. Investors had secured a 100-year special economic zone lease from Japan and now sought charter entry to make the arcology bankable. Lena scanned their projections, her pulse barely stirring. Once she might have railed against such speculators, now she felt only a dull, practiced indifference. Liquidity had its uses, Lena thought. She asked about the Japanese fee structure, found the answer unsatisfying, and quietly moved for delay. Then the next request scrolled across her screen, and she sat straighter. Somaliland. For a moment, Lena was back in the early charter days, the warmth of late-night sessions with their delegation, the improbable optimism of those first commitments. Nearly a decade later, they had completed every reform, their economy quickening as the first million charter signatories built new markets in Hargeisa and lit the port at Berbera with new trade. Approval was no longer a debate, but ceremony. As the vote confirmed, the blockchain expanded and diluted stakes, granting Somaliland citizens a collective 5%. Lena watched her own share shrink, a fraction at a time, and felt lighter as if the charter, at last, could carry itself without her. The final stake adjustment item was a consensus vote on a list of disavowals, factions whose campaigns had strayed too far from protest into confrontation. Force has its uses but needs to be balanced, Lena thought. The debate on Mirov began in waves, rounds of bargaining that echoed the conclaves of old cardinals. An influential cooperative of teachers, the Commons of Knowledge, spoke firmly against. An investor bloc pressed for the charter as the foundation for inter-system colonization, but most signatories abstained. Text flared on Lena's private channel marked in Pramana's crimson. Pramana wrote, "Activist groups are largely opposed but acrimoniously split, and I split them further by triggering old grievances. They will not stand as one against Mirov." A stylized Vikram avatar appeared and gave her a wink. Vikram wrote, "Skycrest Equity's pitch deck supporting Mirov is gaining support. Skycrest publicly offered low-cost capital to sway stakeholders. Militias in the Kachin Hills spat refusal, but the next round Mirov's support increased. In the next round, Mirov's support expanded, so the momentum to acceptance was clear." Jonas's message blinked once before vanishing. Jonas wrote, "The investor group began to fracture, but I feigned panic, which led the group to go conservative. It took 2 more rounds, but support for Mirov succeeded, and the Nunavut arcology was the first to apply." The Commons appended a dissenting opinion, listing Mirov's sordid history and warning of the danger in inviting the fox into the henhouse. They are not wrong, Lena thought to herself and shuddered, remembering the years she worked under Alexander and imagining how much more damage he is going to do once his stake was publicly acknowledged. Lena thought to herself, "I will have to win this time." Lena was certain about Chiwe's fear that Mikhail Mirov, unless stopped, will cause billions of deaths, but she struggled with whether there was an alternative to life extension. The final item was hers alone. Time to cast the die, Lena thought. She moved it forward, researched to force higher throughput in clearing plaques during deep sleep, a dialysis-type machine to circulate blood beyond natural limits and carry drugs through the blood-brain barrier. The corporates welcomed it for profit, activists yielded, and Somaliland asked for trials in their hospitals. The measure passed before resistance could form. The screen dissolved to black. Lena sat quietly in her doubt. Now the world waited for Chiwe to execute her part of the plan. Yet in the silence that lingered, she felt her stomach churn, knowing it would also give one man the means to live forever. Lena's final thought was, "Have I strayed too far?" Chapter 6. Blue Judas, Baltic Sea, 2029, USS Anchorage Bay, had never been a normal ship. On paper, she was an amphibious assault vessel, but in truth, she was the Navy's first drone mothership, a prototype built to test what the future looked like. Her decks held no strike fighters, only racks of autonomous craft, and an experimental telemetry array meant to endure for months, its signals stitched together through a high-altitude tethered platform that drew the scattered battle space into one coherent field. Because she was experimental, everyone wanted eyes on her. Pro-drone advocates hungered for proof, and skeptics hunted for flaws. Across NATO, engineers tracked her telemetry in real time. Anchorage Bay was meant to be transparent. Instead, she became a witness to the defining military event of her generation. Catherine Chambers, the youngest commander of her cohort, woke to claxons and the urgent call of Captain to the bridge. All stations, Condition 1. Condition 1 meant full battle stations. Ever since Chicago was nearly nuked, Navy policy held that Condition 1 meant always being armed. Catherine thought to herself, America's strength has always been our alliances, not armed isolation. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes. The corridor air was dry and cold against her bare feet as she pulled on a jacket and holstered her father's Sig Sauer, P226. She smiled wistfully as the slick metal carried her back to Corpus Christi, to her father's hands teaching her how to seal the pistol against salt and tape the muzzle the summer she turned 12. Catherine heard her father's voice say, "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast." Red floodlights pulsed as she stepped onto the bridge. Status? Lieutenant Commander Rafael Mendoza, silver at the temples, was as steady as the black hills that had raised him. Catherine smiled at the memory of how they butt heads because of his resentment of being passed over for a green commander, but over time, she earned his respect. He looked up from the plot. Our tethered lighter-than-air platform is 5 kilometers above us, peering over the horizon, watching the Russians mass in the Baltic. Washington still calls it a false alarm, but last night, every Eastern Sentinel F-35 tripped a cloud-based logistics software bug. Until Lockheed clears it, the jets are stuck basically in training mode, like flying bricks. Catherine felt a sharp, icy spike and thought, can't be a coincidence. The same anxious undercurrent ran through the bridge. In her mind, she heard her father's voice, the old frogman, steady and insistent. Don't lose the initiative, Catherine. She steadied herself and cut the current with crisp orders. Communications. Report the moment the Lockheed geniuses fix their glitch. Helm. Bring us 3 miles closer to shore and slow to half. Tactical. Ready the Valkyries. Thermobaric drones only if Russian swarms cross the red line. Engineering, confirm telemetry is steady, and report back. She turned last to the Marines at their post. Cupcakes. They bristled at the nickname, annoyance flashing, but still snapped to attention. Keep us safe, and if any Russians come through that hatch, stop them cold. A chorus of aye aye. Captain snapped back, crisp and unified. The gentle ribbing bled the edge from the room until Catherine heard the drone team saying, "Contact! Glide bombs inbound!" When the Russians surged into the Suwalki Gap, it began with glide bombs hurled safely hidden behind the horizon. 40,000 NATO troops, Americans among them, were being chewed to pieces. Over the tactical net, Catherine heard the ground units begging for air cover, their voices ragged and breaking in static against the steady hum of consoles and the pulse of red lights on her bridge. Catherine heard people screaming and pleading. "People are dying. Where's the air screen?" Catherine leaned forward and said sharply, "Signal 6th Fleet. Request current tasking authority and release on air defense and strike." The comms officer snapped back. "Aye, aye, Captain." Mendoza stood at her shoulder, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the tactical display. Catherine thought to herself, his son is down there. He looked carved in stone, but she caught the white of his knuckles on the console rail. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, detached, and edged with iron. "We're watching them die without cover, and all we can do is sit here." Gripens and Typhoons scrambled, but most of the Eastern Sentinel's fighters were F-35s. Russian S-400 batteries in Kaliningrad, deep inside Europe's security perimeter like a cancer, lit up any AWACS forcing the big birds to turn back. The infamous Ghost Squadron waited on Polish runways, hot and ready, but every cockpit showed the same cold message. Authentication fail. The bug had caged NATO's primary defensive screen, its air power. Catherine's jaw clenched, knowing the jets were shackled, controls sluggish and weapons dead. This wasn't an accident. It stank of a political appointee's hand. She remembered the Lockheed rep's promise of full sovereignty transfer. A lie. No partner had ever been granted a code audit of Odin's core, the F-35's cloud-based sustainment and mission software. Any anomaly in the system forced the jets into lockout. The sovereignty transfer was only on paper. Everyone knew the plumbing still ran through Washington. The tactical officer called out, "Captain, Captain, British pilots are on the move." They forced overrides, lit burners, and launched anyway. Their jets screamed into the night, but with performance capped and weapons locked, they were flying fast targets. Commander Evelyn Carter reporting, "Take off the training wheels and unlock the damn targeting software." Her voice tight but firm. An Anchorage Bay observer rebroadcast the transmission to a NATO-wide channel. "We are flying blind." On Anchorage Bay's bridge, a runner brought a sealed order printed with the header that said, "For captain's eyes only." Mendoza intercepted it and laid it face down. Catherine had seen it, but appreciated the plausible deniability that the order was not received. They didn't need to read it to know the order was to kill the broadcast. Every headquarters on the continent and the Pentagon heard Carter and Ghost Squadron. Someone on the channel demanded at least enable stealth, but the Pentagon was silent. In the silence, a junior officer muttered, "Fucking DC politicians." Carter cut in with an edge hard on her voice. "For whoever bricked our birds, we've all read the same intelligence reports. You know what the Russians intend to do to the people down there. Americans are down there too." Carter's words hit Catherine hard. Everyone on the bridge knew someone down on the ground. Ghost Squadron rapidly approached the Suwalki Gap, daring the Pentagon to let them die. Catherine thought to herself, "Come on, you've made your point. Now turn around and let the mechanics jury-rig overrides." "Fine. Fuck America. Our blood is on your hands." The words cut through the air. Catherine burned in shame and resentment that America was not the same as her grandparents' generation. Another sealed order arrived. Mendoza stepped forward to intercept again, but Catherine lifted her hand. "I'll take it." As she read the orders to go dark and withdraw, she felt him still at her shoulder, radiating tension. Catherine thought to herself, "He's breaking." His eyes flicked toward the drone team, and she saw his jaw tighten, the muscles in his neck drawn taut. Then the words burst out, ragged with emotion. "Launch the Valkyries. Target their swarms. Fire now." The tactical crew froze, hands hovering over emergency keys, every gaze sliding to their captain. Catherine lowered the paper, her voice like ice. "Belay that. The order is to go dark and withdraw." For one crazed heartbeat, Mendoza's hand twitched toward his sidearm. Marines readied their rifles, the master-at-arms poised to draw. Catherine stepped in, unflinching, eyes locked on his. "Don't do it." The air grew heavy. No one moved, as if the ship itself held its breath. Mendoza shook, then let his arms fall. The master-at-arms stepped in and took his sidearm. Catherine nodded once. "Master-at-arms, confine him to his quarters." As he was led away, Mendoza walked as if he were a shell. Glide bombs came in low and fast, hidden behind the horizon until the last seconds. A dense wave that struck exposed NATO positions within 30 seconds of detection. Ground radars could barely see them, but Anchorage Bay's tethered platform tracked every bomb. However, Washington had neutered the ship's alerts. The tactical nets thinned into static as people began to understand they were on their own. "Captain Chambers, General David Merrick is on the line," the comms officer said. Catherine put him through. "Catherine, I'm asking you to launch the Valkyries as a precaution." Catherine looked at the comms officer for confirmation as his voice cracked as he stared at the feed. "NATO headquarters in Vilnius. It's gone. A direct strike by a glide bomb." Taking a moment to compose himself, the comms officer said, "Commander Mendoza's son was posted there." She remembered the day Mendoza's son graduated. The sun was harsh on her dress uniform, but Mendoza didn't notice, his face bright with pride as he listened to his son speaking of honor as the valedictorian of his class. Despite her nausea, her crew only saw her coolly say, "I know," the two words cut sharper than any order. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of cooling fans. Someone swore under their breath, another made the sign of the cross, and the hum of the consoles suddenly felt deafening. So Catherine issued orders, aware of the empty space where her executive officer should have been. The shocked bridge staff steadied into routine under her sheer force of will, but beneath that calm, she trembled with fury at the betrayal. Catherine bitterly thought. Same old politics of keeping back essential aid from allies to force compliance. The same thing we did to the Ukrainians or the Kurds or the South Vietnamese. She decided she couldn't change the world, but she could save who she could. Gunny Ramirez, Catherine fixed the senior Marine with her gaze. Aye, aye, ma'am. His reply was crisp, no hesitation. Before we withdraw, engineering needs a full emergency inspection. While they're inside the well deck, your Marines will practice beach insertions. Treat it as live, supplies off, civilians on. You have 6 hours. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 2045. 15 years later, the echoes of Blue Judas still haunted every posting she took. Trust was gone, but the Allied framework endured, and Catherine fought each day to hold it together. Her pre-dawn run traced the curve of the harbor, the air heavy with salt and jet fuel. The water was calm, its surface unbroken, but for the slow rise of patrol wakes. She timed her breathing to the rhythm of the lights along the quay, each lap a quiet rehearsal of discipline and memory. Back in her quarters, she straightened her jacket, a quiet pride stirring at the 3 stars on her collar. Catherine mused. I wish my father saw this. Composed again, she walked into the morning briefing. Everyone stood as she entered, but Catherine lifted a hand. At ease. She crossed to her place at the table and sat as the deputy commander of Indo-Pacific Command, while her boss, Admiral Han, was meeting with the CIA to discuss Mina Star. His chief of staff, Kaya Torres, led the briefing. A tall, broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped gray hair, she always carried herself with quiet, practical authority. Each service branch efficiently provided updates, and after Pacific Fleet's update, Catherine asked, Admiral Ellison, how is the high-altitude mesh network holding up? Are we ready for another Kessler cascade? The Pacific Fleet's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Marcus Ellison, was a lean, sharp-eyed officer with a runner's build, close-cropped blonde hair with a perpetual squint, as if measuring every detail in the room. Yes, ma'am. The high-altitude platforms are solid. No breaks in drone telemetry. Undersea and surface drones give us better fidelity than satellites. If the eyes in the sky go blind again, we're ready, Catherine nodded. And does it keep cargo moving? Marcus shook his head. Outside my lane, ma'am. Commodore Jeremiah Hayashi, a short, plump man in his late 50s, spoke up. As a last resort backbone, we've worked with the cargo carriers and insurers to keep freight flowing, leaving high frequency clear for fleet use. Catherine felt satisfied at the Indo-Pacific Command's performance. After the briefing room cleared, Pacific Fleet Admiral Jonathan Reeves entered, tall and heavy-set with the weight of his authority filling the space. He drew Catherine aside. The Secretary of Defense wants us in Tokyo for an Allied briefing. It's about security concerns over Mina Star. Wheels up in 1 hour. Catherine mentally steadied herself as the world tilted beneath her again, just as it had on the morning of Blue Judas. Tokyo, Japan. 2045. The rain hammered against the windows of Yokota Air Base in western Tokyo. Admiral Richard Hahn, Commander, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, flickered onto the secure feed from Washington. Rain streaked the glass behind the Admiral's image, but his tone was polished, every word deliberate. We'll begin with Mirov Enterprises, Hahn said. Our assessment is that Alexander has, in practice, gained effective control of the company, and through it, the KFE ecosystem, what's branded as the Charter Movement. That assessment leans on financial traces routed through Mikhail's chief of staff, which also provided the seed funding for Lena Barakat, a former Mirov Enterprise executive. He paused, eyes steady on the camera. After the Arcology merger and through affiliates, Mirov-linked entities now hold perhaps a quarter of the KFE stake. Lena has historically refrained from exercising her founder's share, which leaves Mirov carrying nearly all decisions. Effective control was previously masked. The question is, why make it public now? Brigadier General Elaine Marks, Defense Attaché, U.S. Embassy Tokyo, turned a page and snorted. Freedom of movement, knowledge for everyone, exile over execution. Her cropped steel-gray hair barely shifted as she shook her head. Those slogans bought Mirov influence where wealth closed doors. They dressed it as a human rights movement, but in practice it bound populations to his system. Every life sovereign, only so long as you stayed inside the cage. Admiral Hans signaled to Colonel Samuel Ortega, the Pearl Harbor DIA liaison. Red Team? Ortega carried himself with the restless focus of a man who had spent years in the field before trading mud for briefing rooms. Lean and sharp-eyed, he spoke in a clipped tone. 3 board members are public, but indications point to 7 to 10 in total. Dimitra Arvani is suspected among them. The Mirov family may have immense wealth and influence, but they are first among equals. It is not absolute, and at times their reign is contested. Board dissension may moderate Mirov Enterprises' influence over KFE. Urbane and calm, Lisa Harrington, CIA Chief of Station Tokyo, nodded at the Red Team counterpoint. We are certain of what Mirov Enterprises and the Charter have done. What we do not yet understand is why. To endure, we must strengthen our alliances. Politically well-connected, she spoke with the certainty of knowing her words would reach the president unfiltered. Mirov arcologies and charter member states do not just cover half the globe, with nearly 1 billion people moving freely within their network. Unlike China's rise, this bloc is built on choke points such as the Northwest Passage, both gates of the Panama Canal, Somaliland at the Red Sea, and the infrastructure of space. It is a movement with no natural boundary to contain it, hollowing out cities around the world. Catherine remembered how, over the years, her hometown of Houston felt leaner as people left to join the Charter. Catherine fiercely thought to herself, for 20 years, the media have called America's isolation from the world stage the Second Ming Retreat. But we are a new generation, and we will revive the American dream. Yet Catherine felt an icy doubt that perhaps it was already too late. Lisa Harrington paused, her tone sharpening. Now add a constellation of stealth satellites, and you have a non-nuclear first strike capability that strips away the old balance of deterrence. We let this build while we were distracted for 20 years, and our allies moved on. No more. The president has been clear. Our job is to rebuild American power through strong alliances. The goal of this meeting is consensus as the first step toward renewed global leadership. After the briefing, as the principals mingled, Elaine Marks drifted to Catherine's side and pressed a slim, ribbon-tied leather box into her hand. Congratulations on the 3rd star, she said lightly. With a knowing smile, she added, remember the blue star we spotted on our first night navigation mission as cadets? You fed the fish before anyone else. Catherine's pulse ticked faster. The ribbon was cadet blue, which was our agreed warning signal. Whatever Elaine meant, the message had to be in the gift. Elaine, ever the sly fox, loved hiding her warnings in clever wrappings. Later that day, the cedar room was built for diplomacy. Polished wood gleamed beneath soft orange light, and the carpet was thick enough to swallow footsteps, carrying a faint trace of cedar and wax. At the center stretched a long oval table of burnished oak, with consoles inlaid so discreetly they seemed part of the grain. Cushioned seats lined the edges for senior aides. The acoustics were tuned with care, so that natural speech carried clearly without effort. At the head of the table sat Alvaro Serrano, the newly promoted EIC director. His bearing suggested politician more than field officer. His suit was cut like armor, every seam sharp and every gesture deliberate. To his right sat 2 intelligence officers. One was Lucien Vey, known in the DIA briefings as Vellum's handler. He leaned back slightly, watchful even in this secure setting, the ruin of his ears stark under the warm light. Beside him sat Matthias Wendt, silver-haired and rigid, a man ill at ease with the new order. The briefing had noted his rivalry with Serrano, and now, relegated to his staff, he looked every bit the diminished rival. Alvaro gave a nod for Lucien to begin. Vellum, a deep cover asset, recently signaled Valence 9. Vellum gained access to Mirov's most secure archives, a vast repository built over decades and enriched by diligence files from acquisition activity. What Vellum uncovered was that each of the major collapses since 2026 was engineered by a small group calling themselves the Compact. They came together after the nuclear strike on Chicago and the Baltic invasion, driven by the world's indifference. A flicker of unease moved through the room. Catherine caught sharp silences and tight jaws at the memory of Blue Judas. Eyes shifted toward the American contingent. Chicago first, then appeasement. They triggered the failed invasion of Taiwan in a bid to seize the semiconductor industry after the wreckage of China's and Taiwan's economies. The $2032 crash was engineered to replace it with the euro and KFE. The Kessler Cascade of 2034 was set off to blind the world to deep space threats. All of it built toward the final goal of destroying all strategic nuclear armaments and tritium production around the world. Murmurs rose around the table, and Catherine's stomach churned. We reap what we sow, she thought, tasting the bitter fruit of Blue Judas. The goal of Mikhail Mirov, born Arvo Kosk, is to free the world from what he calls the unbridled tyranny of the nuclear powers. His son's goal is simpler. He intends to replace that power with his own, Catherine thought for a moment. What are the implications of Mirov arcologies joining the charter movement? Why reveal now what they worked so hard to hide? Vice Admiral Rika Sato of the Japanese delegation, a compact and controlled woman, glanced at General Park Hyun-woo of South Korea, who held himself rigidly as they remained silent. Their nations had been left intensely vulnerable by American tariffs, by rapidly aging populations, and by the contagion that followed the economic collapse of Taiwan and China. In desperation, they turned to the same unpalatable solution. They allowed charter arcologies to be built as a tax base, while avoiding the political suicide of mass immigration. Air Commodore Lachlan Reed of Australia snapped, his voice hard, the kind that carried years of restrained fury. "What are you saying, American? You know damn well what the charter has done in the past 20 years while you abandoned us to a world on fire. They gave people fleeing human rights abusers and failed states a place to go. They were treated with dignity, not the prove you are a refugee UNHCR rigmarole. Not the slow, miserable death handed to Palestinians." Scoffs rippled at the mention of the old United Nations, abandoned and discredited. The charter cut global violence. China, Turkmenistan, and North Korea eventually emptied their political prisons. It was cheaper to exile people and regain access to stable and prosperous trade, without the vague name and shame campaigns that once drove capricious boycotts and sanctions. The ones who stayed are the ones who chose to. Charter states have grown rapidly. The KFE coin put a floor under how fucking bad life can get. And you stand here and tell us this is just a Mirov ruse? By the end, Reed was on his feet, fingers stabbing the air, his voice rising until he was shouting at the American delegation. The Americans shifted, jaw tightening, but before the Americans could respond, Rear Admiral Genevieve Trudeau of Canada touched Reed's arm. "The charter is too big for anyone to control. If Mirov Enterprises tried to rig the coin, users would just fork it. Mirov could keep their stake, but lose the people. Freedom of movement applies to the coin as much as to the cities. No, Mirov joined the charter for cover on Mina Star, not for control."